There exists, within the architecture of Western sociological thought, a conspicuous absence, a gap where a name should be but isn't. We have terms for nearly every observable social phenomenon. We have anomie, Durkheim's word for the breakdown of social norms that occurs when the bonds between individual and society dissolve. We have alienation, Marx's term for the estrangement of the worker from the product of their labor, from the process of production, from their fellow workers, and from their own human potential. We have cultural hegemony, Gramsci's framework for understanding how the ruling class maintains power not through force alone, but through the manufacture of consent, through the normalization of ideas that serve the interests of the powerful while appearing to serve everyone. We have intersectionality, Crenshaw's insight that systems of oppression do not operate in isolation but compound and interact, producing experiences that cannot be understood through any single axis of identity. We have social reproduction, Bourdieu's demonstration that educational systems do not merely reflect class hierarchies, but actively reproduce them, transmitting advantage and disadvantage across generations through the invisible currency of cultural capital. We have habitus, also Bourdieu's, the term for the set of dispositions, tastes, habits, ways of perceiving and acting, that are produced by one's position in the social structure and that in turn reproduce that position, creating the illusion of natural preference where there is in fact structural programming. The lexicon of sociology is vast. It is, at times, almost embarrassingly precise, a discipline that has generated more terminology than most people encounter in a lifetime, each term representing some specific facet of the relationship between individual and structure, between agency and constraint, between the life you live and the systems that shape it. And yet, despite this terminological abundance, there is no word, no clean, citable, peer-reviewed label for the specific phenomenon that we are about to examine. There is no word for what happens when two human beings, born into roughly equivalent structural positions, take paths so divergent that any reasonable observer would classify them as fundamentally different kinds of people, one ascending to viral fame and music stardom and billboard charts and cash money records, the other descending deeper into the raw machinery of gang culture and criminal justice contact and YouTube notoriety built on the unfiltered documentation of structural precarity, only to reconverge, years later, into what appears to be, from any angle and by any measure, the same person. Not similar, not analogous, not they have some things in common, the same tattoos in the same places on the same parts of the face, the same approximate body mass, give or take 30 pounds, where previously there had been a 100-pound difference, the same color clothing, blue, always blue, the specific blue that signifies Crip gang affiliation, and that functions in this context not as a fashion choice, but as a structural declaration, a chromatic encoding of identity so deep that it precedes language. The same skin complexion, that specific register within the intra-racial aesthetic spectrum of Black America, neither conventionally light-skinned nor conventionally dark-skinned, but occupying a zone that carries its own cultural coding, its own set of social scripts, its own relationship to desirability and danger and institutional processing. The same mannerisms, the arms crossed, the chin slightly elevated, the body language of men who have been institutionalized and who carry that institutionalization in the way they hold themselves, the way they distribute their weight, the way they orient to a camera. The same cadence of speech, the same linguistic register, the same questions asked of the same kinds of women in the same white-walled studio on the same afternoon. There is no word for this, and the absence of that word is itself diagnostic. It tells us something about the limits of sociological language. It tells us that the phenomenon is either so rare that it has escaped academic attention, which is possible but unlikely, given the millions of lives that pass through equivalent structural positions in the United States every generation, or so common that it has been hiding in plain sight, mistaken for coincidence or cultural homogeneity or birds of a feather or some other folk explanation that domesticates the phenomenon and renders it unthreatening. The absence of the word tells us that we have not wanted to name this thing, because naming it would require acknowledging something that the entire American ideological apparatus, from the meritocratic myths of the center to the personal responsibility doctrines of the right to the opportunity expansion frameworks of the left, is designed to deny that structural position is not a starting point. It is a destination. It is not where you begin. It is where you end up. And the path between beginning and ending, the choices, the talents, the efforts, the lucky breaks, the scholarships, the hit records, the viral moments, is not a journey away from the structural position. It is a journey within it, a scenic tour of the interior of a cage whose walls are invisible because they are made not of metal or concrete, but of probability distributions, funding formulas, policing patterns, and the accumulated sediment of 400 years of racial capitalism. What we are going to examine across the next 9 sections of this essay is a case study so vivid, so visually precise, so structurally legible that it does not require statistical modeling or longitudinal data or peer review to interpret. It requires only eyes It requires only the willingness to look at two men standing side by side on a YouTube show and to recognize what the camera is actually capturing. The case study is this: a YouTuber named ryanwitdasauce, who has approximately 962,000 subscribers and has spent the past 2 years building a cultural format called 20 versus 1 into one of the most quietly significant ethnographic archives of Black Gen Z culture currently in existence, recently published a video in which two men, Blueface, born Jonathan Michael Porter, and Crip Mac, born Trevor Hurd, appeared together in a speed dating elimination format, evaluating 20 women in rapid succession. The video was titled 20 Women versus 2 Trolls, Blueface and Crip Mac. It was, on its surface, entertainment, a dating show with comedic elements produced for views and engagement, designed to be clipped for TikTok and debated in comment sections. And it was all of those things, but it was also, inadvertently and perhaps inevitably, one of the most profound illustrations of structural determinism ever captured on camera. Not in a documentary, not in a sociological study, not in an academic paper, on a YouTube dating show, in a white-walled studio, with a host from Monroe, North Carolina, who was almost certainly not thinking about Bordeaux or Gramsci or the school-to-prison pipeline when he positioned those two men on one side of the room and started bringing women in from the other. And this is precisely what makes it so powerful. The best ethnographic data is always collected by people who are not trying to collect ethnographic data. The most revealing documents of social structure are always the ones that are produced within the culture they document, not by observers standing outside it with clipboards and institutional review board approvals. ryanwitdasauce did not design the 20 versus 1 format to demonstrate structural convergence. He designed it to be entertaining. He designed it to generate views. He designed it to build a channel. But the format, through its stripped-down simplicity, a white room, a microphone, a few questions, a binary decision, had the accidental effect of removing all the contextual noise that normally obscures the mechanics of social sorting. And when Blueface and Crip Mac stood in that room together, the noise was gone, and what remained was the signal: 2 men, 2 paths, 1 destination. So here is what we are going to do. But before we proceed, we need to understand why this phenomenon, this structural convergence, has resisted naming for so long, because the resistance is not accidental. It is functional. The unnamed phenomenon stays unnamed because naming it would destabilize the foundational mythology of the society that produces it. Consider what the phenomenon, if named, would imply. It would imply that the American system, the system of public education, criminal justice, labor markets, housing, healthcare, and the 1,000 other institutional mechanisms that together constitute what we call society, is not a ladder. A ladder implies upward mobility. It implies that if you climb, if you work hard enough, if you're talented enough, if you make the right choices, you will arrive at a higher position than the one you started from. The ladder is the central image of American self-conception. It is the visual metaphor that undergirds the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal. The Horatio Alger stories that defined 19th century American mythology, the land of opportunity narrative that justified a century of immigration, the civil rights movement's demand for equal access to the ladder's rungs, and the contemporary mantra of education as the great equalizer. The ladder is not merely a metaphor. It is an ideology. It is the idea that justifies the entire distribution of resources, rewards, and punishments in American life. The people at the top climbed there, and the people at the bottom simply haven't climbed yet. The unnamed phenomenon does not deny that the ladder exists. It denies that the ladder goes anywhere. It suggests that the ladder is not attached to anything above, that you can climb and climb and climb, and the rungs are real, and the effort is real, and the height above the ground increases, and everyone watching from below can see you ascending. But the ladder is on a treadmill. It is moving downward at the same rate you are climbing upward. Your position relative to the ground does not change. Only your exhaustion does. This is what Blueface and Crip Mac demonstrate. One climbed the ladder: football scholarship, Billboard chart, cash money records, viral fame. One never climbed at all, and they arrived at the same position. The ladder didn't fail Blueface. The ladder did exactly what it was designed to do. It gave him the experience of climbing. It gave him the sensation of upward movement. It gave the people watching the narrative they needed. Look, he's making it out. See, the system works. See, the ladder is real. And then, when the cameras turned away and the Billboard chart expired and the prison sentence was handed down, the treadmill beneath the ladder completed its quiet revolution, and he was back at the starting coordinates, standing next to the man who had never bothered to climb at all. Naming this, giving the phenomenon a word that could be cited in papers, taught in classrooms, used in policy debates, would be an act of ideological violence against the ladder mythology. It would force the acknowledgement that upward mobility, for certain structural positions, is not merely difficult, but structurally impossible, that the system is designed, through the emergent interaction of its 1,000 interlocking components, to produce the appearance of mobility while maintaining the reality of stasis. And that acknowledgement is intolerable to a society that requires the ladder myth to justify its inequalities. So the phenomenon stays unnamed, and the people it describes stay unexplained, their convergence attributed to individual moral failure, they couldn't stay out of trouble, cultural pathology, that's just how they are, or cosmic coincidence, isn't it wild that they ended up on the same show? We are going to reject all three of these explanations. We are going to insist, with the rigor and the precision that the phenomenon demands, that the convergence is not failure, not pathology, and not coincidence. It is output. It is what the sorting machine produces. And the machine, once you learn to see it, is as visible and as mechanical and as predictable as any engine ever built. So here is what we are going to do. We are going to take this signal seriously. We are going to treat a YouTube dating show as a primary source of the same analytical weight as any sociological monograph. Because in the 21st century, the data that matters most is not generated by universities or think tanks or government agencies. It is generated by people with cameras and ring lights and subscriber counts, people who are embedded in the social structures they capture, people who have no reason to distort the data because they don't know they're collecting it. We are going to examine the blueface Crip-Mac convergence through the lens of structural analysis, through the lens of a 1998 Disney film that turns out to be a more useful analytical framework than most graduate seminars, through the lens of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy of the will to power, and through the lens of what that philosophy cannot account for when applied to a system that was never designed but operates with the precision of engineering. We are going to examine how two men, one a former high school football star turned chart-topping rapper turned Cash Money Records signee, the other a self-described 55th Street neighborhood Crip who built his following by broadcasting his raw, unfiltered structural position to the world, arrived at the same coordinates, same show, same day, same blue, same tattoos, same body type, same women, same questions, same structural position. And we are going to ask the question that the absence of a word has been protecting us from asking. If they arrived at the same place despite taking the most divergent paths imaginable, then what does path even mean? What does choice even mean? What does making it out even mean? If out turns out to be just another way of spelling in, the phenomenon has no name. By the time we are finished, it still won't have one, because the phenomenon is too large, too multi-causal, too deeply embedded in the very language and conceptual frameworks we would use to describe it. But the attempt to name it will crack open something that has been sealed shut by the mythology of American individualism, by the bootstrap narrative, by the meritocratic fairy tale that insists structural position is a starting line and not a finish line. The attempt will fail, but the failure will be more illuminating than any success, because it will show us the exact shape and dimensions of the thing we cannot name, the invisible architecture that produced two different men who turned out to be the same man, standing side by side in a white-walled studio, wearing blue, covered in ink, asking 20 women if they have a job. Before we can fully reckon with what happened in that white-walled studio, before we can understand the full weight and implication of two men in blue standing shoulder to shoulder, indistinguishable on a YouTube dating show, we need to establish a framework. We need a lens through which to view the convergence, a way of understanding what it means when divergent paths produce identical outcomes. And the framework, improbably, counterintuitively, and with a kind of analytical elegance that no academic text could match, begins with a 1998 Disney film, The Parent Trap, directed by Nancy Meyers and starring an 11-year-old Lindsay Lohan in a dual role, is not typically cited in sociological discourse. It has never appeared on a graduate seminar syllabus. It has not been the subject of critical theory, cultural studies, or structural analysis. It is classified by every available metric, genre, target audience, critical reception, cultural positioning, as a family comedy. A lighthearted, commercially successful, critically well-received family comedy about twins in summer camp in a scheme to reunite divorced parents. It grossed $92 million worldwide. It spawned a generation of kids who fantasized about having a secret twin. It cemented Lindsay Lohan as a child star. And it contains, embedded within its cheerful premise like a fossil in amber, one of the most elegant demonstrations of structural determinism in the history of popular cinema, a demonstration that becomes visible only when you perform the specific analytical operation of stripping away the comedic framing, ignoring the target demographic, disregarding the entertainment function, and examining the architecture of the story as if it were a sociological case study rather than a Disney film. Let us perform that operation now. The premise of The Parent Trap is as follows. Hallie Parker and Annie James are identical twin sisters who were separated at birth when their parents divorced. Their father, Nick Parker, is a wealthy vineyard owner in Napa Valley, California. Their mother, Elizabeth James, is a refined and successful wedding gown designer living in London, England. Each parent took custody of one daughter and, by implicit mutual agreement, never told either daughter about the existence of her twin. Hallie grew up American, specifically Californian, specifically Napa Valley Californian, which is to say she grew up in one of the most affluent, agriculturally picturesque, and culturally specific microenvironments in the United States. Annie grew up British, specifically London British, Specifically, the kind of London that involves a townhouse and a butler and a mother whose professional and social circles intersect with British high society. The geographical distance between these two upbringings is not merely significant. It is civilizational. We are not talking about two suburbs of the same city. We are not talking about two neighborhoods separated by a freeway. We are talking about two countries, two continents, two linguistic traditions, American English versus British English, which are not merely different accents, but different relationships to class, formality, directness, humor, and emotional expression. Two educational systems, the American public/private school dichotomy versus the British state/independent school hierarchy, with its entirely different set of class signifiers. Two sets of cultural norms governing everything from table manners to the acceptable volume of one's voice in public, to the degree to which it is appropriate to discuss money, to the relationship between masculinity, femininity, and emotional vulnerability. On the surface, and the surface is where most analyses of the film stop, the geographical and cultural implications on each girl's life should produce what any reasonable person would characterize as irreconcilable differences. Irreconcilable, not in the sense of hostility, but in the sense of fundamental incompatibility. You would expect that one person raised in the casual, sun-drenched, entrepreneurial, frontier mythologizing, informality celebrating, wealth displaying environment of Northern California, and another person raised in the formal, rain-soaked, class-stratified, understatement valorizing, wealth-concealing environment of London would develop into fundamentally different kinds of human beings. The American would be louder. The Brit would be quieter. The American would be more direct. The Brit would be more circumspect. The American would be more comfortable with displays of ambition and self-promotion. The Brit would be more attuned to the social penalties of appearing to try too hard. These are not stereotypes. They are cultural dispositions. Bordeaux's habitus, operating at the level of national culture rather than class position. And the film does gesture toward these differences. Hallie is tomboyish, adventurous, and brash. Annie is poised, deliberate, and speaks with the clipped precision of someone who has internalized the rhythms of upper-class British English. But here is what the film actually demonstrates, beneath its entertainment veneer, in the structural logic that the plot cannot function without. None of those differences matter. When the twins arrive at Camp Walden, a summer camp in Maine, positioned geographically as a kind of neutral territory between California and London, between American and British, between the two worlds that should have made these girls irreconcilable, they recognize each other almost immediately. Not because of a dramatic plot device, not because a wise counselor sits them down and reveals the truth, but because the fundamental architecture of who they are is identical. Their genetic profile, their shared biological birthright, the double helix of DNA that was copied perfectly at the moment of conception, overwhelms every environmental variable that should have differentiated them. The accents are different, yes. The vocabularies are different, yes. The wardrobes are different, yes. But the cognitive patterns, the emotional responses, the social instincts, the way they assess other people, the way they process conflict, the way they laugh, the way they scheme, the way they move through physical space, all of these are convergent. The twinness is not overridden by the geography. The twinness does not merely survive the geography. The twinness consumes the geography. It metabolizes it. It reduces the civilizational distance between California and London to a cosmetic difference, an accent, a wardrobe, a set of table manners that can be switched like a costume in a matter of days. This is, if you are willing to take it seriously, an extraordinary claim embedded within a children's film. It is the claim that identity is not produced by environment. It is the claim that who you are, at the deepest, most structural level, is encoded before environment has the opportunity to operate. It is the claim that nature, in the form of genetic identity, is so powerful that nurture, even nurture operating across an oceanic divide, across a linguistic divide, across a class-cultural divide, cannot overwrite it. The twins are interchangeable because the thing that makes them who they are preceded and superseded the things that should have made them different. Now, there is a detail in the film that most viewers register unconsciously but do not examine, and it is this detail that elevates The Parent Trap from a charming observation about twins to a genuine structural argument. The detail is this. Both parents, independently, chose to send their respective daughters to the same summer camp. Stop and consider what this means. Nick Parker, a vineyard owner in Napa Valley, California, and Elizabeth James, a wedding gown designer in London, England, two people who divorced when their daughters were infants, who have had no contact in the intervening years, who live on different continents, who have, to all appearances, built entirely separate lives, independently made the decision to send their children to Camp Walden in Maine. They did not coordinate. They did not consult. They were not aware of each other's decision, and yet they arrived at the same choice. Within the film's narrative logic, this is treated as a convenient coincidence, the plot device that makes the story possible. But within the structural logic of the film, the logic that operates beneath the narrative, the logic that the story requires but never examines, this is not a coincidence. It is a structural inevitability. It is the manifestation of shared structural position operating across geographical distance. Think about what has to be true for both parents to independently choose the same summer camp. They both have to value a specific type of childhood experience, the outdoorsy, character building, away from home, sleepaway summer camp tradition that is itself a product of upper middle class and upper class Anglo-American culture. They both have to have the financial resources to send a child across an ocean or across a continent for a summer of recreation. They both have to be embedded in social networks where this specific camp, Camp Walden, not some other camp, is known and recommended. They both have to trust the institution enough to send their child there. They both have to make the decision at the same time, in the same summer, despite having no communication with each other. Every one of these conditions is a product of structural position. The value system that prioritizes character-building outdoor experiences for children is a class disposition. The financial capacity is a class resource. The social networks in which specific camps circulate as recommendations are class networks. The trust in the institution is a class orientation toward institutions. Nick Parker and Elizabeth James chose the same camp, not because of cosmic coincidence, but because their shared structural position, affluent, Western, English-speaking, culturally Anglo, upper professional class, produced the same disposition, the same resources, the same social connections, and the same decision. The camp was a coordinate that their structural position made inevitable. Even in separation, even in apparent divergence, the structural position pulled them, independently, unknowingly, as if by gravity, to the same point on the map. And the twins, meeting at that point, discovered what the audiences meant to find delightful, but what structural analysis finds terrifying, that the divergence was an illusion, that the different accents and different wardrobes and different continents were surface-level variations on a theme, that the structural position, the shared birthright of being born to those parents in that class, at that historical moment, was the deep reality, and everything else was decor. What happens next in the film deepens the structural argument further. The twins switch places. Hallie goes to London pretending to be Annie. Annie goes to Napa Valley pretending to be Hallie. Each girl must learn the other's world, the mannerisms, the relationships, the daily rhythms, the specific social codes of a life she has never lived. And what they discover is that the learning curve is shockingly shallow. They can master each other's accents in days. They can adapt to each other's social environments in weeks. They can navigate each other's relationships with parents, with household staff, with friends, with a fluency that would be inexplicable if the environmental differences were as profound as they appear. The film presents this as the magic of twinness, as evidence that the bond between identical twins transcends circumstance, and that is one reading. But the structural reading is more precise and more unsettling. The twins can switch places successfully, not merely because they share DNA, but because the two environments, despite appearing radically different, are structurally the same environment. Napa Valley vineyard wealth and London design world prestige are different expressions of the same structural position. Affluent, Western, English-speaking, culturally sophisticated, institutionally embedded, resource-rich. The specific expression varies. American versus British, entrepreneurial versus artistic, new money versus old prestige. But the structural coordinates are identical. The twins are interchangeable because the environments are interchangeable, at the level of structure, if not at the level of surface. There is one final dimension of the Parent Trap that warrants examination before we leave the film and carry its framework forward into the white-walled studio. The film contains a subtle asymmetry between the two parents that most viewers register as characterization, but that structural analysis recognizes as a class gradient within a shared structural position. The father, Nick Parker, is wealthy by American standards. He owns a vineyard in one of the most expensive agricultural regions in the United States. He employs staff. He lives in a large, comfortable home, but his wealth has a specific texture. It is entrepreneurial. It is recent, in generational terms. It is tied to a tangible product, wine, and it is displayed in the American manner, casually, with an emphasis on lifestyle rather than lineage. The mother, Elizabeth James, inhabits a different register of the same broad wealth category. She lives in a London townhouse. She employs a butler named Martin, played by Simon Coons. She designs wedding gowns for a clientele that, the film implies, includes the British elite. Her wealth, or more precisely her position, carries the quietness of old money or proximity to old money. There is a formality to her life, a sense of institutional depth that suggests she did not create her position from scratch, as Nick, the vineyard owner, appears to have done, but inherited it, or married into it, or was born adjacent to it in a way that conferred its benefits without requiring its explicit accumulation. The father has money, the mother has position. These are not identical, and in most contexts, in most sociological analyses, in most real-world scenarios, the distinction between entrepreneurial wealth and inherited position would constitute a meaningful class gradient. The father is upper middle class by American standards. The mother is upper class by British standards. These are different things. and yet the twins are still interchangeable. The gradient within the shared structural position, the difference between American money and British prestige, between new wealth and old position, does not prevent the switch. It does not prevent the convergence. It does not introduce an irreconcilable difference, because the structural position, at its most fundamental level, is defined not by the specific form of advantage, but by the fact of advantage itself. Both children were born into advantage. Both were born into resource richness. Both were born into institutional embedding, the kind of life where institutions, schools, camps, professional networks, legal systems, work for you rather than against you. The specific flavor of that advantage, American entrepreneurial versus British hereditary, is a within-category variation, not a between-category distinction. And within-category variations, the film demonstrates, do not prevent convergence. They merely give the convergence different accents. This, all of this, is the framework. This is the lens. And when we pick it up and carry it out of the Disney film and into the Ryan-Witdasauce studio, when we apply it to Blueface and Crip Mac instead of Hallie and Annie Parker, what we see is the same structural physics operating in a completely different register. Not the register of affluence, but the register of precarity. Not the convergence of privilege, but the convergence of constraint. Not Camp Walden in Maine, but a white-walled studio in Los Angeles. Not two girls discovering they are twins, but two men demonstrating, for anyone with the structural literacy to read it, that they have always been twins, structural twins, produced by the same machine, sorted into the same category, delivered to the same coordinates despite paths so divergent that they should have led to different galaxies. The Parent Trap is the framework, the Ryan-Witdasauce episode is the data, and the analysis that connects them is the unnamed phenomenon, the thing that has no word, the convergence that the entire American ideological apparatus is designed to deny, the gravitational pull of structural position that turns divergent paths into the same destination. We begin. Jonathan Michael Porter was born on January 20th, 1997, in Los Angeles, California, a city that functions, for the purposes of structural analysis, less as a single metropolitan entity and more as an archipelago of microenvironments, each with its own gravitational field, each sorting its inhabitants into trajectories that feel like choices but operate like conveyor belts, each producing outcomes that appear individual but are in fact statistical regularities expressed through the medium of a single life. Los Angeles is the city where the American sorting machine operates at its most visible and its most invisible simultaneously. Visible because the wealth gradients are inscribed in the physical landscape with almost cartographic precision. You can literally watch the sidewalks improve and the trees multiply as you drive from South Central to Brentwood. Invisible because the entertainment industry that dominates the city's cultural output is specifically designed to produce narratives of individual triumph that obscure the structural machinery operating beneath them. Los Angeles is the city that manufactures the meritocratic myth. It is also the city that most comprehensively disproves it. Porter grew up in Mid-City in central Los Angeles. The first thing you need to understand about his childhood is its transience, not the romantic transience of a road trip or a gap year, but the structural transience of economic instability and fractured custody. He attended multiple elementary schools. He moved between his mother's home in Santa Clarita Valley and his father's in Oakland. He passed through Burbank, the San Fernando Valley, and back again, each move representing not a family adventure but a recalibration of domestic arrangements driven by forces that an elementary school student has no capacity to control or even fully comprehend. This pattern of movement is itself a structural signature, as diagnostic as any census data or school funding metric. Children who attend multiple elementary schools are not exploring. They are being moved. They are being relocated by the economic and domestic pressures operating on their parents. Evictions, custody shifts, new jobs, lost jobs, new relationships, failed relationships. The constant search for a living situation that is both affordable and adequate, which in Los Angeles is a search that can take a lifetime without succeeding. And each move, while it may feel temporary to the adults making the decisions, imprints permanently on the child's relationship to institutions. A child who has attended 5 schools by age 12 does not experience school as a cumulative institution, as a place where knowledge builds on knowledge, where social bonds deepen over years, where a teacher in 4th grade can reference what a teacher in 2nd grade taught because both teachers exist in the same institutional context. That child experiences school as a series of interruptions. Each new school is a cold start. New teachers who don't know your name, new social hierarchies you must decode on the fly, new rules you must learn by breaking them. The cumulative effect is not educational failure, though it may produce that, but educational alienation, a fundamental disconnection from the institutional logic of schooling, a sense that school is not a home but a transit station, not a community but a succession of temporary arrangements. This alienation produces a specific skill set. Children who move frequently develop social fluency, the ability to read a new environment quickly, to calibrate behavior for survival, to build rapport fast and move on without attachment. They develop adaptability. the capacity to function in unfamiliar settings, to tolerate ambiguity, to improvise when the rules are unclear. They develop a particular kind of emotional self-sufficiency, not the healthy self-reliance of a child who feels securely attached and therefore confident in exploring the world, but the defensive self-reliance of a child who has learned that the world is unstable and that depending on institutions or relationships for continuity is a losing bet. These are skills that serve you well in certain contexts. They serve you well in the entertainment industry, which rewards social fluency, quick rapport building, and the ability to perform confidence in unfamiliar settings. They serve you well in prison, which rewards the ability to read an environment for threats, calibrate your behavior for survival, and form alliances quickly while maintaining emotional distance. They serve you well, in other words, in exactly the context that Blueface's structural position would deliver him to. They do not serve you well in the context that was supposed to be his escape, sustained institutional engagement over 4 years at a university 2,500 miles from home. The skill set produced by his childhood, adaptability, social fluency, defensive self-reliance, was precisely the wrong skill set for the thing that was supposed to save him. The structural position had prepared him to survive in any environment while belonging to none. After relocating to the San Fernando Valley, Porter attended Arleta High School, where something happened that, within the American mythological framework, is supposed to change everything. He became a high school athlete. Not just any athlete, a quarterback. Not just any quarterback, a good one. After a growth spurt during his sophomore year that pushed him to 6 feet 2 inches, he became the team's starting quarterback and demonstrated the kind of talent that activates the entire apparatus of American athletic recruitment: the scout visits, the game film sessions, the phone calls from college coaches, the implicit promise that sport is the golden escalator, the one institution in American life that reliably converts physical talent into class mobility, regardless of background. Porter threw for 1,234 yards and 17 touchdowns in 2013. He improved those numbers to 1,724 yards and 21 touchdowns in 2014, leading his team to an East Valley League championship. These are not trivial statistics for a high school quarterback in the competitive landscape of Los Angeles high school football. These are the kind of numbers that generate legitimate college interest, that place a name on recruiting lists, that create the material conditions for what America calls opportunity, and the opportunity materialized. Porter committed to play football at Fayetteville State University, a historically black university in Fayetteville, North Carolina. This decision, and the structural significance of this decision, cannot be overstated, because it represents the activation of one of the most symbolically and historically loaded institutional pipelines in American life, the HBCU football scholarship. Historically, black colleges and universities were not created to educate. They were created to liberate. They were built in the aftermath of the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era with an explicit, stated foundational purpose: to transform the structural position of formerly enslaved people and their descendants through access to education. The Moral Act of 1890, the philanthropic efforts of organizations like the Freedmen's Bureau and the American Missionary Association, the tireless work of black educators and community leaders, all of these converge to create institutions whose very existence is an argument against structural determinism. HBCUs were designed as escape hatches. That is their founding ideology. They exist to take young black people from one structural position and deliver them to another. When Jonathan Michael Porter accepted a football scholarship to Fayetteville State, he was not merely changing his zip code. He was entering a pipeline that had been designed, explicitly, historically, with enormous effort and sacrifice, to transform structural position. He was doing the thing. He was making the move. He was, in the language of the American meritocratic narrative, taking advantage of the opportunity. He was proving that talent and effort could overcome circumstance, that a kid from Mid-City who'd attended 5 schools could earn a scholarship to a university 2,500 miles away and start building a different life. He traveled those 2,500 miles. He arrived in North Carolina. He was supposed to redshirt his first year, to practice with the team without playing in games, preserving a year of athletic eligibility while he acclimated to the college level. This is standard practice for freshman athletes, and for most players, the redshirt year functions as a period of institutional integration. You learn the playbook, you build relationships with teammates and coaches, you take classes, you develop the kind of institutional trust that comes from sustained engagement with a community that knows your name. But when the starting quarterback, a fifth-year senior, went down with an injury, Porter was called off the bench. He played in one game against West Georgia and threw 2 touchdowns with no interceptions. The senior healed. Porter returned to the bench. Within months, he dropped out and returned to California. Now, here is where the structural analysis diverges sharply from the standard narrative, and where the divergence matters enough to spend time on. The standard narrative treats Porter's departure from Fayetteville State as an individual failure. He couldn't hack it. He got homesick. He lacked the discipline. He wasn't committed enough. Maybe he had character flaws. Maybe he wasn't as serious about school as he was about football. Maybe he was lazy. The standard narrative, in other words, does exactly what the American ideological apparatus always does. It locates the cause of the outcome inside the individual, because locating it inside the structure would require acknowledging that the structure itself is the problem, and acknowledging that the structure is the problem would require changing the structure, and changing the structure would require redistributing power and resources, and redistributing power and resources is the one thing the system will not do. The structural reading of Porter's departure from Fayetteville State is different, and it is more disturbing precisely because it does not require you to believe he was lazy or undisciplined or lacking in character. The structural reading goes like this. Here is a young man who has attended 5 different schools by the time he graduates from high school. He has never experienced sustained institutional stability. His entire childhood has been characterized by movement, from home to home, school to school, neighborhood to neighborhood, parental configuration to parental configuration. He has developed, as a survival adaptation, a skill set oriented toward rapid acclimation and shallow engagement rather than deep institutional trust. He has never had the experience of staying in one place long enough for an institution to know him, to invest in him, to become a community rather than a temporary arrangement. He has never had the experience that middle-class and upper-class children take for granted, the experience of belonging to an institution, of being held by it, of trusting that it will still be there next month and next year. And then, at 18, this young man is deposited, alone, in a state he has never visited, at a university he has never seen, or seen only briefly during a recruiting visit designed to sell rather than inform. 2,500 miles from every person in every place he has ever known. He is expected to do something he has never done in his life. Stay. Stay in one place. Stay at one institution. Trust the institution to fulfill its promises. Trust the process of redshirting, of waiting, of investing in a future payoff rather than seeking immediate gratification. Trust that if he does the work, the institution will reward him. Every single one of these expectations requires a skill that Porter's structural position had systematically prevented him from developing. The ability to stay requires the experience of stability, which he never had. The ability to trust an institution requires the experience of being served rather than processed by institutions, which he never had. Schools that move children through like cattle chutes do not build institutional trust. The ability to wait for a future payoff requires the experience of delayed gratification being reliably rewarded, which is an experience that poverty and instability actively destroy. In environments of scarcity, delayed gratification is irrational because the future is not guaranteed. The surprise, from a structural perspective, is not that Porter left Fayetteville State. The surprise is that anyone expected him to stay. The surprise is that the entire apparatus of American athletic recruitment, the scouts, the coaches, the scholarship committees, the university admissions offices, deposited this young man in an environment that required precisely the capacities his childhood had made it impossible to develop. And then, when he left, classified the outcome as a personal failure rather than a systemic one. The scholarship was supposed to be the escape hatch. But the escape hatch required a kind of institutional engagement that the structural position had made structurally impossible. The key didn't fit the lock, and the lock blamed the key. Back in Los Angeles, Porter worked minimum wage jobs, a stint at Office Depot, other jobs whose names have not survived in the public record. He was, at this point, a failed quarterback, a college dropout, a young black man in mid-city Los Angeles with no credential and no institutional affiliation, a description that fits, with minor variations, millions of young men in the United States, most of whom will never be the subject of a YouTube video essay, most of whom will navigate their structural position in silence, processing through the systems designed to process them without ever generating the kind of data that makes the processing visible. Porter was, in other words, exactly where his structural position predicted he would be. The scholarship and the touchdown passes had been a detour, a brief excursion through a different set of institutional coordinates, but the conveyor belt had resumed its default trajectory and returned him to the coordinates that were encoded at birth. He was back in Los Angeles. He was working for minimum wage. He was embedded in the same networks, the same neighborhoods, the same cultural ecosystem that his childhood had prepared him for and that the scholarship had briefly, misleadingly, appeared to offer an exit from. And then the second escape hatch appeared, even more improbable than the first, and in a form that the sorting machine had not been designed to account for. Porter wandered into a friend's recording studio to retrieve a phone charger. The friend, a producer named Laudiano, challenged him to rap over a beat. He accepted. What followed was not a moment of discovered talent in the Hollywood sense. There was no orchestra swell, no montage sequence, no slow-motion shot of a star being born. What followed was a sound that was so strange, so disconnected from the conventions of the genre, so apparently incompetent in its relationship to rhythm and beat, that it would, within 2 years, become one of the most viral phenomena in American popular music. In January 2017, under the name Blueface Bleed'em, a name that warrants examination in itself because it is a compound of two structural declarations. Blueface, a reference to the blue-tinted $100 bill, and, by extension, to money, ambition, and the aspiration toward wealth that defines the structural position. And Bleed'em, a reference to his affiliation with the Schoolyard Crips street gang, and by extension, to the gang culture that is one of the primary organizational frameworks of the structural position. Porter began recording music and uploading it to SoundCloud, the platform that had, by 2017, become the primary launchpad for rap artists who lacked access to traditional industry gatekeepers. By October 2018, the music video for Respect My Crippin' had been posted to Worldstar Hip Hop's YouTube channel and had gone viral. But the virality was not of the kind that the music industry typically generates. It was not the virality of a catchy hook or a memorable melody or a guest verse from a bigger artist. It was the virality of bewilderment. Viewers were simultaneously captivated and baffled by Blueface's rapping style, which was so far off beat, so disconnected from the instrumental track over which he rapped, that it seemed like a glitch, a mistake, a man rapping to a song that was playing in a different room. The comment sections filled with attempts to articulate what was happening. Blueface told the beat it could have a head start. His voice was on the highway, the beat ain't leave the house yet. 200 seagulls fighting over a piece of bread. Whether Blueface's offbeat style was intentional, as he has claimed, stating that the beat goes on my accord, I don't go on the beat's accord, or an artifact of a self-taught rapper who genuinely could not hear the conventional relationship between voice and instrumental is, for our purposes, irrelevant. What matters is that the style became a meme, the meme became attention, the attention became followers, and the followers became an audience. By early 2019, his single, Thotiana, a song whose content, sexual objectification, party culture, braggadocio, is entirely standard within the genre, but whose delivery, that offbeat flow, that voice, was entirely novel, had peaked at number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100, spawning remixes with Cardi B and YG. Cash Money Records signed him to their West Coast affiliate. Drake posted studio clips with him on Instagram. Ice Cube co-signed him. Kendrick Lamar acknowledged him. He was, by every conceivable metric, fame, money, industry connections, cultural visibility, chart position, a man who had transcended his structural position. He had done it not through the conventional pipeline, education, credential, professional employment, but through the entertainment pipeline, which is the one pipeline in American life that appears to offer transcendence without requiring institutional engagement. You don't need a degree to go viral. You don't need a credential to sign a record deal. You just need the thing, the talent, the charisma, the moment, the content, and the internet and the industry will do the rest. But here is what the structural analysis insists we examine, and what the standard narrative of making it elides completely. What exactly had Blueface transcended? He had acquired money, yes. He had acquired fame, yes. He had acquired cultural visibility, yes. But the substance of that money and fame and visibility, the actual content that generated them, was itself a product of his structural position. Respect My Crippin' is a song about gang affiliation. Thotiana is a song about sexual objectification within a specific subcultural register. The Schoolyard Crips reference is embedded in his stage name. The Benjamin Franklin face tattoo, which preceded his musical career and which he described as his commitment to the lifestyle, his point of no return, the irreversible bet, is a permanent physical encoding of structural position onto the body itself. Blueface did not transcend his structural position. He monetized it. He packaged it. He branded it. He broadcast it to millions of people who consumed it as entertainment. And the system rewarded him for this, handsomely, visibly, in ways that looked, from the outside, like escape. But monetizing your structural position is not the same as leaving it. It is, in fact, the deepest form of remaining in it because it makes the position itself the source of your value. You cannot leave the thing that pays you. You cannot transcend the performance of a position when the performance is the entire basis of your economic existence. The more successful you are at monetizing your structural position, the more inextricably bound to it you become. The money doesn't create distance from the position. The money is the position's reward for your loyalty. There is one final dimension of Blueface's pre-prison identity that must be examined because it is central to the convergence that we will track across the remaining sections of this essay. In his pre-prison incarnation, Blueface was a sex symbol. He was not merely a rapper who happened to be attractive. His physical appearance was foundational to his commercial success in a way that is specific to his archetype within the ecosystem of black male celebrity. At 6'2", with an athletic build that retained the lean muscularity of his football days, a complexion that sat in a specific zone of the intra-racial aesthetic spectrum, neither conventionally light-skinned nor conventionally dark-skinned, but in a register that carries its own cultural coding, a register that reads as pretty boy, but with enough edge and masculinity to prevent the designation from becoming a liability. and a bone structure that invited comparisons to Kelly Oubre, the NBA shooting guard who occupies a similar beautiful but dangerous archetype, Blueface attracted a disproportionately female audience base. Young women looked at him and saw not just a rapper, but a figure of aspirational masculinity, a man whose physical beauty promised transcendence, whose face and body suggested that he was destined for a trajectory beyond the structural position that his lyrics described. He was, in a very real sense, performing a double act. His music performed the structural position, gang affiliation, street culture, sexual exploitation, while his body performed the escape from it, beauty, athleticism, the promise of becoming something more. This double performance, strutting the structural position while wearing the face of transcendence, was not a contradiction. It was the source of his appeal. It was the tension that made Thotiana compelling, the irony of a beautiful man singing about disposability, the friction between the attractiveness of the messenger and the crudeness of the message. This matters enormously because prison would destroy it. Prison would take that body, the lean, angular, pretty boy body that had been central to his appeal, central to his commercial viability, central to the narrative of transcendence that his fame appeared to embody, and transform it into something else entirely, something heavier, something denser, something covered in ink, something that no longer looked like escape, something that looked, instead, like Crip Mac. Trevor Hurd was born in Ontario, California, a city in San Bernardino County in the Inland Empire, which occupies a specific and often overlooked position in Southern California's socioeconomic geography that is essential to understanding the structural conditions that produced the man who would become Crip Mac. The Inland Empire is not Los Angeles. It is what Los Angeles produces. It is the exurban overflow zone where the coastal city's sorting machine deposits populations whose structural position does not afford them proximity to the centers of capital, institutional power, and cultural production that cluster along the Pacific coast. It is what happens when housing prices in Los Angeles push certain populations eastward over the San Gabriel Mountains and into the flat, sun-scorched, infrastructure-thin expanse of the inland valleys. Ontario is cheaper than Los Angeles. It is also further from the institutions, the universities, the hospitals, the cultural centers, the legal aid organizations, the social services that function as buffers between vulnerable populations and the full force of the structural position they inhabit. The Inland Empire is, in sociological terms, a second-order product of the sorting machine. Los Angeles is the machine. The Inland Empire is where the machine's outputs accumulate when they cannot afford to remain near the machine itself. This produces a specific set of conditions: lower housing costs, paired with lower access to public services, lower school funding, lower proximity to employment centers, higher commute times, higher exposure to environmental hazards. The Inland Empire's air quality is among the worst in the nation, a consequence of its geography, a basin that traps smog, and its economy, warehousing and logistics, with their attendant diesel pollution. The people who live in the Inland Empire are not there because they chose it from a menu of equally attractive options. They are there because the menu of options available to their structural position placed the Inland Empire at the top and the west side of Los Angeles at the bottom, which is to say, beyond reach. Trevor Hurd was born into this environment, and his ethnic heritage, Samoan and Belizean, places him in a specific position within the already specific structural context of the Inland Empire's black and brown communities. This heritage requires careful examination because it is central to the phenotypic convergence that makes the Blueface Crip Mac twinning so visually striking. Both Blueface and Crip Mac occupy what might be described as the 65-35 phenotypic profile, a term that requires definition because it describes a specific and often unexamined category within the intra-racial aesthetic spectrum of Black America. The 65-35 profile describes a person who is unmistakably black in the way they are read by American racial classification systems. They will be classified as black on any census form. They will be processed as black by any police encounter. They will be sorted as black by any institutional intake, but whose features carry visible traces of other ethnic backgrounds without resolving into the conventional mixed category that American culture typically reserves for people with one black parent and one white parent, the Drake/J. Cole/Obama paradigm of mixedness, which is a specific cultural category with its own set of social scripts, desirability metrics, and institutional processing patterns. The 65-35 profile is different from conventional biracial classification because the non-black ancestry does not dominate the phenotype. It inflects it. It modifies it at the margins, in the bone structure, in the hair texture, in the complexion, in the width of the frame, without overriding the fundamental blackness of the overall presentation. Crip Mac, with his Samoan and Belizean heritage, carries the broad frame and the specific facial structure that suggest Polynesian ancestry, but he does not look Samoan in the way that, say, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson looks Samoan. He looks black, but black in a way that, if you are paying attention, if you are literate in the visual grammar of diasporic phenotype, registers as having other things going on beneath the surface. Blueface, with a black mother and a father who appears to fit a biracial aesthetic, carries a similar inflection, a complexion and feature set that is legibly black but carries a trace of something else, something that manifests not as conventional mixedness, but as a kind of phenotypic depth, a layering of ancestries that produces a face and body that do not fit neatly into the standard categories. This matters because in a culture where skin color and feature sets activate different social scripts, where light-skinned black men and dark-skinned black men navigate different assumptions about intelligence, dangerousness, sexual desirability, and institutional trustworthiness, occupying the same phenotypic register means, in a very real and measurable sense, being processed by the same set of social scripts. Both men are seen the same way. Both men are processed the same way. Both men activate the same set of responses in the people who encounter them. The same level of perceived threat in a police encounter, the same level of perceived attractiveness in a sexual encounter, the same level of perceived cultural authenticity in a music industry encounter. The 65-35 profile is a structural coordinate as precise as a zip code, and both men occupy it. Where Blueface's early life was characterized by transience and the constant search for an institutional foothold, football as potential escape, education as potential ladder, music as eventual monetization, Crip Mac's trajectory is defined by something almost entirely absent from Blueface's story, the total failure of institutional mediation at every stage. Crip Mac has spoken publicly, in interviews with platforms including Vlad TV, about being diagnosed with ADHD, oppositional defiance disorder, and schizophrenia. This triad of diagnoses, taken together, describes a child whose neurological profile makes it exceptionally difficult to navigate institutional environments, school classrooms, structured activities, rule-bound systems, without behavioral conflict. ADHD produces an inability to sustain attention and an excess of physical energy that institutional settings are not designed to accommodate. Oppositional defiance disorder, a diagnosis that is itself controversial, with many clinicians viewing it as a pathologization of rational resistance to unfair authority, produces a pattern of defiant, disobedient, and hostile behavior toward authority figures. Schizophrenia, depending on its severity and age of onset, produces perceptual disturbances, disordered thinking, and social withdrawal that can make institutional functioning impossible. In well-resourced communities, in the communities that the structural position of affluence produces, this triad of diagnoses typically results in therapeutic intervention, a child psychiatrist, an individualized education plan, medications carefully titrated and monitored, a school system that has the funding and the staff to provide behavioral support, a family that has the resources and the knowledge to advocate for the child within the system. The outcome is not guaranteed to be positive, but the institutional apparatus at least attempts to address the conditions rather than merely punishing their symptoms. In under-resourced communities, in the Inland Empire, in Ontario, in the communities that the structural position of precarity produces, the same triad of diagnoses triggers a completely different institutional response. The child is classified as a behavioral problem. The school does not have the funding for a dedicated behavioral specialist. The classroom does not have the capacity to accommodate the child's needs. The teacher, who is managing 30 other students and is herself underpaid, undertrained, and operating within a school system that has been systematically defunded, cannot individualize instruction for a child who is disruptive, defiant, and, in the case of schizophrenia, potentially experiencing perceptual realities that the institutional environment has no framework for understanding. What happens next is predictable with the reliability of a chemical reaction. The child is expelled, not from a single school, but from the educational system as a concept. The child is classified as unteachable, removed from mainstream classrooms, shunted into alternative education programs, disciplinary programs, and eventually, in Crip Mac's case, military school. Military school, in the context of black and brown youth in Southern California, is not an educational institution in any meaningful sense. It is a holding facility. It is a way station between childhood and the adult carceral system. It is where children are sent when every other institution has given up on them, not because the children are beyond help, but because the institutions that should be helping them lack the resources, the training, the patience, and the structural incentive to do so. Military school does not transform structural position. It warehouses it. It keeps the child physically contained and nominally supervised until the child ages into the jurisdiction of the adult criminal justice system, at which point the warehousing can continue under a different institutional name. From military school, Crip Mac's trajectory unfolds with the grim predictability of a structural itinerary. Transportation of a controlled substance in 2014, grand theft in 2015, attempted second-degree armed robbery in 2017, possession of a firearm as a felon in 2021, possession of a firearm as a felon again in 2022. Each charge represents a specific interaction between a person and the systems designed to process people in his structural position. Each charge is, in structural terms, not a deviation from a normal life, but a station along a route that was laid out before the person was old enough to read the map. The controlled substance charge is the drug economy, the parallel labor market that exists in every community where the formal labor market has failed to provide sufficient employment at sufficient wages. The drug economy is not a pathology. It is an adaptation. It is the labor market's response to its own absence. When there are not enough legitimate jobs, and the legitimate jobs that exist pay wages that cannot sustain a life, and the credential requirements for better paying legitimate jobs are accessible only through an educational system that has already expelled you. The drug economy is what fills the gap. It is, in economic terms, a perfectly rational response to market failure. It is also illegal, which means that participating in it subjects you to the criminal justice system, which creates a felony record, which further reduces your access to legitimate employment, which deepens your dependence on the parallel economy, which increases your probability of rearrest. The cycle is not a spiral. It is a ratchet. It only turns one way. The grand theft is the property crime that surfaces when the income from the parallel economy, or from legitimate employment, or from both, cannot keep pace with need or desire. The armed robbery is the escalation that occurs when the risk calculus shifts, when the consequences of crime no longer seem meaningfully worse than the conditions of legitimate life, when prison stops being a deterrent and starts being a known quantity, a place you've been or a place people you know have been, a part of the landscape rather than a threat from outside it. And the repeat firearm charges, possession of a firearm as a felon twice, represent the recursive loop of the carceral system operating at its most elegant and its most cruel. Once you have a felony conviction, possession of a firearm becomes a federal offense. This means that the mere act of existing in an environment where guns are commonplace, which is to say, the environment that your structural position defines, the environment where guns are present because the state has abdicated its monopoly on violence, and the community has developed its own mechanisms of protection and enforcement, becomes a crime. The system criminalizes the structural position and then punishes you for inhabiting it. You are arrested not for doing something wrong, but for existing in a place where the things that exist are classified as wrong by a legal system that has no investment in changing the conditions that produce them. Crip Mac emerged as a public figure through a mechanism that is, in its own way, as structurally revealing as Blueface's viral meme moment, where Blueface's entry into public consciousness was mediated by the music industry, World Star Hip Hop, Cash Money Records, Billboard, the formal and informal gatekeepers of the hip-hop ecosystem. Crip Mac's emergence was unmediated. He pointed a camera at his life and broadcast it. There was no label. There was no A&R representative. There was no playlist curator or music journalist or industry executive who decided to invest in his career. There was only YouTube, Instagram, the raw documentary impulse, and a life that was sufficiently compelling, sufficiently dramatic, sufficiently authentic, sufficiently far from the curated performances of mainstream celebrity to generate an audience. His persona is totalizing in a way that Blueface's never was, and the totality of it is itself a structural artifact. The name, Crip Mac, is not a stage name in the conventional sense. A stage name implies a separation between the person and the persona, between the private self and the public presentation. Blueface is a stage name. It refers to the $100 bill. It is clever. It can be worn and removed. It exists at a distance from Jonathan Michael Porter. Crip Mac is not a stage name. It is a declaration of ontology. It says, I am a Crip. That is what I am. Everything else, the YouTube channel, the interviews, the social media presence, the music, the public appearances, is subordinate to that primary identity. The name does not describe what he does. It describes what he is. The blue bandana, the blue shoes, the blue t-shirt that reads, that's an awful lot of standing on cuesiness. A phrase that is itself a linguistic artifact of the Crip practice of replacing the letter B, associated with the rival blood gang, with the letter C, associated with Crip, transforming business into cuesiness in a phonetic act of allegiance that is simultaneously playful and deadly serious. The 55th Street callouts that begin and punctuate every interaction, the invocation of his specific set within the neighborhood Crip hierarchy, which functions not as small talk but as territorial declaration, the Hoover Killer tattoo across his forehead, a permanent, irreversible declaration of intergang enmity that forecloses entire categories of social interaction, geographic movement, and institutional engagement, because you cannot negotiate, cannot compromise, cannot coexist with the thing you have tattooed on your face as an enemy. Every element of Crip Mac's public presentation is a declaration of structural position, but, and this is the asymmetrical insight that distinguishes structural analysis from moralistic commentary, the declaration is not reluctant, it is not ashamed, it is not the tortured confession of a man who wishes he were somewhere else. It is joyful, it is proud, it is loud, it is performed with a theatrical energy that suggests not entrapment but ownership, the radical ownership of a position that the mainstream world classifies as failure. Crip Mac does not apologize for his structural position. He celebrates it, he broadcasts it, he turns it into content and identity and community and, yes, income. And in doing so, he reveals something that the narrative of transcendence desperately needs to obscure, that the structural position is not merely a place of deprivation. It is also a place of meaning, of belonging, of identity, of community, of the specific forms of knowledge and skill and resilience that develop when formal institutions have failed and people must build their own systems of survival. This is the deepest asymmetry between Blueface and Crip Mac, the one that makes their eventual convergence so analytically devastating. Blueface tried to leave. He took the scholarship. He recorded the music. He signed the deal. He pursued what America calls success. Crip Mac never tried to leave. He never acquired a credential or a chart position or an industry cosign. He built his following by being, with a completeness and a consistency that is itself a kind of art, exactly what his structural position produced. He did not monetize a performance of transcendence. He monetized the position itself, raw and unfiltered, and the audience came not in spite of the rawness, but because of it. In an era of curated authenticity, where rappers perform streetness from gated communities, where Instagram filters smooth every surface, where the entertainment industry manufactures realness as a product category, Crip Mac offered something genuinely rare, the thing itself. Not a representation, not a simulation, not a performance calibrated for consumption. The actual, unmediated, structurally embedded reality of a life defined by gang affiliation, criminal justice contact, mental health challenges, and the specific forms of community, humor, resilience, and beauty that grow in the soil of precarity. His fan base grew, not despite the rawness, but because the rawness was, in a media landscape saturated with fake authenticity, the most authentic thing available. Crip Mac hovers between 270 and 290 pounds. He is about 6 feet 1 inch. His face is covered in dense, heavy tattoos, not the carefully placed, aesthetically deliberated tattoos of a post-SoundCloud rapper who gets inked at a celebrity tattoo parlor in Hollywood, but the institutional tattoos that mark a body as having passed through specific environments. Prison tattoos, street tattoos, tattoos whose aesthetic is not commercial but communal, not decorative but declarative. His build is not the build of a man who works out at Equinox. It is the build of a man whose body has been shaped by the caloric landscape of his structural position, the cheap, calorically dense food of the informal economy, the weight piles of the prison yard, the body that results when the structural position does not include a nutritionist or a personal trainer, but does include long stretches of incarceration where lifting weights is one of the few activities available and where physical size is a survival asset. He is, in other words, the uninterrupted output of the sorting machine. He is what the structural position produces when no scholarship, no hit record, no viral moment, no industry cosign diverts the conveyor belt. He is the control group. And when Blueface, the experimental group, the subject who was given every variable that America says should alter the outcome, emerged from prison looking, sounding, and behaving like the control group, the experiment was over. The hypothesis of transcendence had been falsified. The sorting machine had proven that its output is independent of its input's ambitions. Here is where the two paths, the path of attempted transcendence and the path of uninterrupted structural flow, converge. And the site of convergence is, with the terrible symmetry that structural analysis both predicts and dreads, the American prison system. Not a metaphorical prison, not the prison of limited opportunity, or the prison of low expectations, or any of the other metaphorical prisons that commentators invoke when they want to sound compassionate without actually examining the physical, institutional, brick and razor wire reality of mass incarceration. The actual prison system, the one with cells and commissaries and visiting hours and yard time and the specific, measurable, documentable effect of transforming human bodies and human psyches in ways that serve the structural position rather than the individual. Blueface, the man who was supposed to have made it out, the quarterback who threw touchdowns at Arletta High, the billboard artist who charted at number 8, the Cash Money signee who had Drake in his studio and Cardi B on his remix, and Kendrick Lamar acknowledging his existence, was sentenced on August 9th, 2024, to 4 years in California State Prison. The proximate cause was a violation of probation tied to a 2021 assault of a security guard at a lounge in North Hollywood. But the proximate cause is almost cosmically irrelevant to the structural analysis. The proximate cause is the door through which the structural position entered, not the force that pushed. Examining the proximate cause of Blueface's imprisonment is like examining the specific gust of wind that toppled a tree while ignoring the decades of root rot that made the tree unstable. The assault happened because Blueface was at a North Hollywood lounge, which he was at because his fame and lifestyle embedded him in the nightlife ecosystem of Los Angeles, which is an ecosystem defined by alcohol, ego, territorial display, and the specific forms of masculine performance that the structural position rewards and the formal legal system punishes. The probation violation occurred because the probation itself existed, which it did because of prior legal entanglements, which existed because of behavioral patterns shaped by the environment, which existed because of the structural position, which existed because of the moment and place and circumstances and racial category and class position and family configuration and school funding formula and policing pattern and every other variable in the sorting machine's algorithm at the moment of Jonathan Michael Porter's birth on January 20th, 1997 in Los Angeles, California. You can trace the causal chain backward as far as you want. You can follow it through the specific charges and the specific courtrooms and the specific judges and the specific decisions made by specific prosecutors and defense attorneys. And at no point in that chain will you find a clean moment of individual culpability, a moment where you can say with confidence, here, this is where the individual's choices, and only the individual's choices, determine the outcome. You will find instead a continuous interaction between a person and a system, an ongoing negotiation between individual behavior and structural constraint, in which the individual's behavior is itself a product of the structural constraint that the system claims to be responding to neutrally. The system produces the behavior. The system then punishes the behavior. The system then uses the punishment as evidence that the behavior was the individual's fault. It is a closed loop of causation disguised as justice. Crip Mac's imprisonment followed a parallel but compressed timeline. In September 2023, police found him in possession of a ghost gun, a handgun with no serial number, making it untraceable, and 10 rounds of ammunition. For a man with his felony history, 5 arrests since 2014, at least 1 prior conviction, possession of a firearm is not merely a state charge. It is a federal offense, carrying sentences that are dramatically more severe than state-level prosecution would produce. The case was initially filed in Los Angeles County Superior Court, but in a maneuver that defense attorneys describe as common when local authorities grow frustrated with what they perceive as lenient sentencing for repeat offenders, the state charges were dropped so that federal prosecutors could take over. Curtis Briggs, a California defense attorney who commented on the case, explained the logic bluntly. Local authorities sometimes escalate cases to the federal system specifically to increase the prison time available. In April 2024, Crip Mac pleaded guilty in federal court to 1 count of being a felon in possession of ammunition. In July 2024, he was sentenced to 33 months, 2 years and 9 months, in federal prison. He was released in early 2026, a video of him dancing with joy upon exiting the prison facility going viral across social media. Both men went to prison. Both men went to prison within months of each other. Blueface sentenced in August 2024. Crip Mac sentenced in July 2024. Both men went to prison for reasons directly, demonstrably, causally connected to their structural position. Blueface stood for an assault that occurred within the nightlife ecosystem that his fame had embedded him in. Crip Mac for possessing a weapon in the neighborhood environment that his structural position made it functionally impossible to leave. And both men came out transformed, but the direction of the transformation was not the direction that the word transformation typically implies. They did not come out reformed. They did not come out rehabilitated. They did not come out different. They came out more like. This demands a deeper examination of what prison does, not what it claims to do, not what the signage on the Department of Corrections building says it does, but what it actually, empirically, measurably does to the human beings who pass through it. Because the convergence of Blueface and Crip Mac is not merely a visual coincidence or a cultural curiosity. It is evidence of a transformation mechanism, a process by which the prison system takes inputs of varying configurations and produces a standardized output. The American prison system is, in structural terms, a normalizing institution. This is Michel Foucault's insight from Discipline and Punish, applied to the specific context of 21st century mass incarceration. The prison does not merely punish, it produces. It produces a specific kind of subject, a person whose body, whose psychology, whose social orientation, whose relationship to authority, whose aesthetic presentation, whose worldview has been shaped by the institutional environment into a form that the system can process, predict, and control. The prison does not rehabilitate, because rehabilitation would mean producing someone who no longer fits the system's categories. The prison normalizes. It takes the aberrant input, the famous rapper, the successful athlete, the man who appeared to have escaped the structural position, and returns it to specification. Consider what the prison environment does to a body. It removes the body from every context that made it legible as something other than a prisoner. The designer clothes are replaced by institutional uniforms. The curated diet of someone with disposable income is replaced by the caloric profile of institutional food. Starchy, processed, calorically dense, nutritionally hollow. The gym membership and the personal trainer are replaced by the weight pile. A set of iron plates and bars in a concrete yard where the available exercises are heavy, compound, mass-building movements performed without the guidance of a fitness professional. The result is a specific body type, heavy, dense, functional rather than aesthetic, carrying the mass distribution pattern of a man who bench presses and squats with heavy weight and eats whatever the commissary provides. This is not the body of a billboard artist. This is the body of a prisoner. And when Blueface emerged with this body, when the lean, angular, pretty boy frame had been replaced by this dense institutional mass, the body itself was a document. It testified to where he had been. It announced what system had processed him. It brought his physical presentation into alignment with the default output of the structural position. Consider what the prison environment does to a face. The face is the site of identity. It is how we are recognized, how we are categorized, how we present ourselves to the world and to the institutions that process us. In the formal world, the face is kept relatively unmarked, clean-shaven or groomed, adorned perhaps with glasses or minimal jewelry, presented in a way that signals institutional belonging and professional competence. In the prison world, the face is a canvas, a surface on which allegiances, affiliations, rank, history, and commitment are permanently inscribed through tattoo. Prison tattoo culture is not aesthetic in the sense that mainstream tattoo culture is aesthetic. It is declarative. It is the use of permanent bodily modification to encode social information, gang membership, set identification, kills claimed, enemies named, time served, onto the most visible and most irreversible site on the body. When Blueface entered prison with one carefully placed face tattoo and emerged with 15, the prison had not failed to prevent him from getting tattoos. The prison had succeeded in normalizing him, in bringing his aesthetic presentation into alignment with the institutional norm, the standard output, the default configuration of a man who has been processed by the California state prison system. Consider what the prison environment does to the psyche. Incarceration produces a specific psychological orientation. Hypervigilance, emotional compression, the prioritization of physical presence over verbal nuance, the cultivation of an imposing exterior to deter aggression, the development of alliance formation skills that prioritize loyalty and reliability over compatibility or affection. These psychological adaptations are not pathological in the prison context. They are survival skills, as functional and as necessary as any skill taught in any institution. But they are also the psychological profile of the structural position's default output. They are the same psychological orientation that Crip Mac carried before, during, and after his own incarceration, because Crip Mac's entire life had been an extended engagement with the environments, the street, the jail, the prison yard, that produced this orientation. When Blueface emerged from prison carrying this psychological profile, the hypervigilance, the emotional compression, the imposing physical presence, he was not damaged. He was normalized. He was brought into alignment. He was, psychologically, the same man as Crip Mac. When Blueface's prison photos began surfacing on social media, first through video calls with his mother, Carlissa Saffold, in mid-2025, then through a series of Instagram posts from prison in July and August 2025, the reaction was genuine, widespread, almost visceral shock. The lean, angular, pretty boy frame that had been central to his appeal, the body that made him a sex symbol, the silhouette that had invited comparisons to Kelly Oubre and that had carried the implicit promise that this man was different, that he was above the structural position, that his beauty was evidence of a destiny beyond the sorting machine's output, was gone. In its place was a man who had gained somewhere between 60 and 80 pounds of bulk, not the sculpted bulk of a fitness model or a Hollywood actor preparing for a superhero role. The dense, heavy, functional bulk of a man who has been lifting weights in a prison yard, the specific kind of mass that accumulates when the available exercise is heavy compound movements, bench press, squat, deadlift, performed with prison yard equipment. The available nutrition is calorically dense but nutritionally impoverished, commissary snacks, institutional meals, heavy on starch and processed protein. And the hormonal environment of incarceration, high cortisol from chronic stress, disrupted sleep patterns, the specific endocrine effects of prolonged confinement, pushes the body toward mass accumulation rather than lean refinement. Blueface himself claimed he had climbed to 230 pounds, a figure that represents a gain of approximately 70 pounds from his pre-prison weight, a transformation so dramatic that his own mother, seeing him for the first time in nearly 2 years via a prison video call, posted to Instagram, "This my first time seeing and hearing my baby in almost 2 years." But the weight gain, as dramatic as it was not the most striking transformation. The most striking transformation was his face. Blueface's pre-prison face had carried one prominent tattoo, the Benjamin Franklin portrait on his right cheek, placed deliberately and, in its way, artistically. A tattoo that functioned as a brand element, a visual signature, a piece of the aesthetic identity that made Blueface a recognizable name in a crowded media landscape. It was a commercial tattoo. It was legible to the mainstream. It could be read as edgy without being alienating. It was the kind of tattoo that could appear on a billboard chart and not look out of place. The post-prison face was unrecognizable. Dense, heavy tattoos now covered his forehead, his cheeks, both sides of his face, the areas around his eyes. These were not commercial tattoos. These were not aesthetic choices made in consultation with a celebrity tattoo artist in a clean studio with good lighting. These were prison tattoos, the specific kind of ink that is produced in the specific institutional environment of California state prisons, using the specific tools, improvised tattoo guns made from motor components, sewing needles, and ink derived from soot or pen cartridges, and the specific aesthetic conventions, dense coverage, heavy black lines, symbolic imagery drawn from gang and prison culture that mark a body as belonging to the carceral system. Whack 100, the music manager and cultural commentator who maintains connections within the California prison ecosystem, suggested publicly that Blueface had become addicted to prison tattoos. The phrase, whatever its clinical validity, captures something structurally important. The prison environment has its own culture of bodily modification, its own aesthetics, its own norms about what a man's face should look like, and these norms are as powerful, as binding, as totalizing as the norms of any other culture. When Blueface entered prison with one face tattoo and emerged with 15, he was not making a series of individual aesthetic decisions. He was being acculturated. He was being transformed by the institutional environment in the same way that a freshman at an Ivy League university is transformed by that institutional environment, absorbing the norms, adopting the markers, internalizing the codes that signal belonging. The difference is that the Ivy League environment transforms you in the direction of institutional power, and the prison environment transforms you in the direction of the structural position. Social media commenters, confronting the before and after images, struggled to reconcile what they were seeing. Whoever this is must have ate Blueface. He aged like 50 years in jail. They need to let him out before he tattoo his nose. His own mother addressed the steroid rumors, the internet's default explanation for any dramatic physical transformation, insisting that her son was simply eating and lifting weights. How the hell is he going to get some steroids? He barely getting some GD food in there. But the steroid debate, while understandable as a cultural response to a jarring visual transformation, missed the analytical point so completely that engaging with it almost obscures the real significance of what happened. The point is not how Blueface gained the weight. The point is not whether the weight gain was natural or enhanced. The point is not even the weight itself, considered in isolation. The point is what the totality of the transformation, the weight, the face tattoos, the posture, the expression, the institutional markers visible in every element of his post-prison presentation, signifies in structural terms. It signifies convergence. It signifies the closing of the distance between the experimental group and the control group. It signifies the collapse of the divergent path into the structural default. Because when Blueface emerged from prison at 225 to 230 pounds, face covered in dense institutional ink, wearing the posture and expression and body language of a man who has been acculturated by the California prison system, when those photos were placed, even informally, even casually, in the same visual field as existing images of Crip Mac, the visual was no longer two rappers who happened to be on the same show. The visual was twins, same approximate weight class, Blueface at 225 to 230, Crip Mac at 270 to 290, both firmly in the big man category, both carrying the dense, functional mass of men who have done serious time. Same face tattoos, dense, institutional, covering the same zones of the face, produced by the same cultural practices, signaling the same institutional affiliations, same complexion, that 65-35 phenotypic profile, same wardrobe, blue, the Crip blue, worn, not as fashion but as structural declaration, same posture, arms crossed or hands clasped, chin elevated, shoulders squared, the body language of institutionalization. The prison system had completed the job that the structural position had started. It had taken the one variable that distinguished Blueface from Crip Mac, the beauty, the leanness, the aesthetic of transcendence, the pretty boy promise that this man was different, and eliminated it. It had replaced that variable with the institutional markers that Crip Mac had always carried. It had brought Blueface into conformity with his structural twin. It had manufactured the convergence that the structural position had always predicted, but that fame and money and billboard charts had temporarily obscured. And then, in the ultimate structural coincidence, a coincidence so symmetrical that the word coincidence strains under the weight of its own implausibility, both men ended up on the same YouTube show, on the same day, in the same studio, wearing the same color, asking the same questions, of the same women. This was their Camp Walden moment. This was the dock at the lake. This was the moment of recognition, not between the two men who may or may not have experienced it consciously, but for the audience, for anyone watching with structural literacy. The most divergent paths imaginable, within a shared structural position, had produced the same man twice. Ryan Witdasauce, born Ryan Ivy from Monroe, North Carolina, is a YouTuber who has, over approximately 2 years, built something that functions simultaneously as entertainment, social experiment, and ethnographic archive. His channel, with approximately 962,000 subscribers and millions of views per video, is organized around a format he calls 20 versus 1. A speed dating elimination game in which a featured guest evaluates 20 potential romantic interests in rapid succession, asking questions and making binary, advance, or eliminate decisions. The format has been iterated, refined, and expanded. Sometimes it is 20 women versus 1 man, sometimes 20 men versus 1 woman, sometimes 20 versus 2, sometimes involving comedians rather than rappers, sometimes involving reality TV personalities rather than musicians. But the core mechanic remains constant: a white-walled studio, a microphone, a parade of human beings evaluated under time pressure, and a featured guest whose responses reveal with startling clarity the cognitive and social algorithms that govern their engagement with potential partners. The guest roster reads like a census of Black cultural visibility in the mid-2020s, and examining it in aggregate reveals the specific stratum of celebrity that the format occupies. Ryan has featured Bro Rilla, Woody, Natalie Nunn, Charleston White, The Game, Finesse 2 Times, India Love, Chrissy and Rock, Skrilla, Lil Woody, Baby Chief Duet, 1900 Rugrat, Jocelyn Hernandez, K-Camp, Kodak Black, Big Boogie, Chief Keef, Trick Daddy, Deshae Frost, J Cinco, Fredo Bang, Big 30, Rich Homie Quan before his passing, Lil Reese, Boozy Badaz. These are not, for the most part, artists at the zenith of mainstream commercial visibility. They are not Drake or Kendrick or Beyonce. They are figures who occupy a specific register of Black celebrity, famous enough to generate substantial viewer interest, embedded enough in specific subcultural ecosystems to produce authentic rather than performed interactions, and, crucially, positioned at the intersection of entertainment and structural precarity that makes their participation in the format sociologically revealing. The 20 versus 1 format has, through consistent iteration, become a genuine cultural institution within Gen Z media. It is not merely a YouTube series, it is a framework, a way of organizing social encounters that has been absorbed into the cultural vocabulary of its audience. People reference it, people anticipate it, people debate the guests' decisions in comment sections with the analytical intensity that previous generations brought to sports commentary. The format has spawned imitators across platforms. It has generated an ecosystem of clip channels and reaction content. It has, in the specific way that internet content achieves cultural significance, become a thing. Not a viral moment, but a persistent framework, a recurring structure through which social reality is both performed and examined. The Blueface and Crip Mac episode, titled 20 Women vs. 2 Trolls, Blueface and Crip Mac, is a 65-minute video that was, at the level of production, simply another installment in the series. Ryan set up the studio. He brought in 20 women. He brought in 2 guests. He turned on the cameras. The video was produced for the same reason all the other videos were produced: to generate views, to engage the audience, to build the channel, to continue the format. But at the level of structural analysis, this episode was something else entirely. This was the Camp Walden moment. This was the coordinate where 2 divergent paths intersected. Not by narrative design, not because someone read Bordeaux and decided to create a visual demonstration of structural convergence, but because the sorting machine, operating with its characteristic indifference to human intention, deposited both men at the same point at the same time. Consider the chain of events that had to align for this episode to occur. Blueface had to emerge from the specific trajectory of fame, legal trouble, incarceration, and post-prison cultural positioning that made him available and willing to appear on a YouTube dating show in this particular period. Crip Mac had to emerge from the specific trajectory of street notoriety, incarceration, release, and post-prison cultural positioning that made him available and willing to appear on the same show in the same period. Both men had to be in Los Angeles. Both men had to be in the specific cultural ecosystem where ryanwitdasauce operates, the ecosystem of mid-tier Black celebrity appearances, YouTube content creation, and the informal economy of paid appearances and content collaborations that constitutes the post-viral career path for figures at this level of visibility. Both men had to be available on the same day. Both men had to agree to appear together. Each of these conditions is individually contingent. Any one of them could have failed to materialize. Blueface could have been in prison rather than out. Crip Mac could have been in a different city. Either of them could have been booked for a different appearance. The scheduling could have been incompatible. The chemistry could have been wrong. 1,000 different variations of timing and circumstance could have prevented this specific configuration of 2 specific men in one specific studio on one specific afternoon. And yet, the structural reading insists that the configuration was, if not inevitable in the strict deterministic sense, then overwhelmingly probable in the statistical sense. Because both men, despite their divergent paths, were orbiting the same structural center. Both men were products of the same sorting machine. Both men were embedded in the same cultural ecosystem, the ecosystem of Black male public figures whose structural position includes gang affiliation, criminal justice contact, physical transformation through incarceration, and the specific mode of post-prison cultural engagement that involves YouTube appearances, social media content, and the informal economy of celebrity. Within that ecosystem, the 20 versus 1 format is a gravitational node, a point that the ecosystem's inhabitants naturally orbit toward. It is not surprising that both men ended up there. It would have been surprising if they hadn't. When they stood side by side on that white backdrop, the visual was devastating in its clarity. Both men were wearing blue, blueface in a gray-blue hoodie with prestige embroidered on the chest, the fabric carrying the studied casualness of streetwear fashion. Crip Mac in his characteristic oversized blue t-shirt, the white text reading, "That's an awful lot of standing on cusiness." Both men wore fitted caps, dark-colored, logo-bearing, pulled slightly to the side or backward in the specific manner that signifies casual masculine authority within this aesthetic register. Both men had face tattoos, dense, covering the forehead, cheeks, and jaw, the ink dark and heavy, the coverage extensive enough that the original skin was visible only in patches. Both men were large, Blueface's post-prison bulk placing him, for the first time in his public life, in the same physical category as Crip Mac. Both men shared the same complexion, that 65-35 phenotypic profile, the same zone of the intra-racial aesthetic spectrum. They stood together, and from any distance, greater than a few feet, they were indistinguishable, not because they were literally identical. Blueface is taller, Crip Mac is heavier, the specific tattoos differ in design, but because the structural markers they carried were so convergent, so aligned, so thoroughly the product of the same machine that the individual variations were overwhelmed by the categorical sameness. They were, to borrow a statistical term, within the margin of error. Two data points from the same distribution, close enough to the mean that the difference between them was noise, not signal. Ryan opened the show with his characteristic energy, the camera-facing warmth and comedic timing that has made him one of the most consistent content creators in the Black YouTube ecosystem. He introduced the guests, he set the stakes for the audience, likes, subscriber goals, the familiar architecture of engagement that funds the entire operation. The cameras rolled, and what unfolded over the next 65 minutes would prove to be one of the most structurally revealing documents of American social sorting ever produced, not because anyone intended it to be, but because the format, in its stripped-down simplicity, had created the conditions for structural reality to become visible. Women began approaching, one at a time, from across the white expanse of the studio floor. Each one walked the same path, from the edge of the set, across the empty white space that functioned as a kind of evaluative no man's land, toward the two figures in blue who stood on the opposite side like gatekeepers at a border crossing. The women carried microphones. They were dressed in the aesthetic register of the parallel economy: bodysuits, platform boots, fur-trimmed heels, leopard print, crop tops. The specific visual grammar of attractiveness that this subcultural context produces and rewards. Their hair, their nails, their body modifications, their jewelry. Every element of their presentation was a cultural artifact, a product of the same structural position that had produced the men evaluating them. They were not dressing for a job interview or a gallery opening or a church service. They were dressing for this, for a speed dating elimination show on YouTube, filmed in a white-walled studio in Los Angeles, hosted by a man from North Carolina, judged by two men in blue whose combined criminal record spans more than a decade. What was immediately striking, what hit the structural analyst like a physical force, was the rhythm of the interactions. Both men fell into a pattern almost immediately, a call and response rhythm that was not rehearsed, but emerged organically from the shared cognitive software they were running. Crip Mac would open with his territorial declaration, 55th Street General Baby, establishing the affiliational framework. Then one or both men would ask the first sorting question, the woman would answer, the men would confer, leaning toward each other, muttering, exchanging glances, their body language a perfect mirror of twin deliberation. Then the evaluation would escalate. More questions, the 360 request, the final determination, advance or eliminate, stay or go. The conferring was itself a structural artifact. Watch the way they lean into each other, Blueface slightly tilting his head toward Crip Mac turning his body to face Blueface, their arms crossed in matching postures, their faces carrying the same expression of evaluative concentration. This is the body language of men who have spent time in institutional settings where collective decision-making is a survival practice. In prison, you confer with your people before you act. On the street, you check with your homies before you commit. The conference is not a dating show affectation. It is an institutional behavior transplanted into an entertainment context. And it functioned in this studio exactly as it would have functioned in a prison yard or on a street corner, as a mechanism for distributed risk assessment, where two individuals pool their observations to produce a joint evaluation that is more reliable than either individual's assessment alone. The women who were advanced, who passed the evaluation and were permitted to continue to the next round, a round that, in the logic of the show, implied the possibility of a more extended encounter, a phone number exchange, a date, shared characteristics that the structural analysis can identify even when the men themselves could not articulate them explicitly. They were women who answered the geographic question without triggering territorial alarm. They were women who answered the occupation question in ways that signaled parallel economy embedding without extreme institutional entanglement. They were women who performed the 360 without resistance, signaling acceptance of the transactional framework. They were, in short, women whose structural position was maximally compatible with the structural position of the men evaluating them, women who could be incorporated into the men's social and sexual ecosystem without generating the kinds of institutional contact, police, courts, child protective services, rival gang networks, that the structural position trains you to avoid. The women who were eliminated, who were turned away, often with Cripmac's characteristic bluntness or Blueface's quieter shake of the head, were eliminated not for failing to be attractive or for failing to be interesting, but for failing the structural compatibility test. A woman from the wrong neighborhood, a woman whose occupation signaled too much institutional visibility, a woman whose energy or self-presentation suggested a degree of independence or institutional embedding that would complicate the structural ecosystem the men inhabited. The eliminations were not cruel, though they could appear that way to viewers outside the structural position. They were efficient. They were the sorting machine operating at the individual level. Two men, trained by decades of structural experience, applying the machine's logic to the specific task of partner selection. And through all of it, through every interaction, every question, every conference, every 360, every advance, and every elimination, the synchrony between the two men was astonishing. They did not disagree on a single evaluation in any way that reflected genuinely different criteria. When they differed, it was on specifics, this woman's attractiveness versus that woman's attractiveness, rather than on framework, what counts as attractive, what counts as compatible, what counts as a risk. The framework was shared, the algorithm was shared, the cognitive software was identical. Two men who had met as strangers, or at most as cultural acquaintances, aware of each other's public personas, operated as a single evaluative unit, producing synchronized outputs from synchronized processes because the structural position that had produced both of them had installed the same operating system. This is the summer camp moment rendered in 4K. This is Camp Walden with a YouTube channel and 962,000 subscribers. This is the dock at the lake where two twins discovered that the distance between them, the billboard chart and the booking sheet, the cash money contract and the ghost gun, the pretty boy silhouette and the 290-pound frame, was never real, was never structural, was always and only a variation in surface while the depth remained identical. And what unfolded over those 65 minutes was, in its most essential form, a sustained, real-time demonstration of two men running the same cognitive and social software, asking the same questions, applying the same criteria, making the same evaluations, in a manner so synchronized that it could not be explained by conscious coordination, or cultural imitation, or the influence of being on camera together. They were not imitating each other. They were not performing similarity for the audience. They were being who they were, independently, simultaneously, and the who they were turned out to be the same person. The summer camp had done its work, the twins had found each other, and the recognition, when it came, was not a plot twist. It was a structural inevitability. What elevated the Blueface and Crip Mac episode from a visually striking curiosity to a genuine sociological document was not merely the convergence of appearance, the matching blue, the matching tattoos, the matching builds, but the convergence of cognition, the way they thought, the way they evaluated, the way they processed each woman who approached them across the white floor of that studio. The questions they asked were not random. They were not spontaneous. They were not the idiosyncratic expressions of two individual personalities. They were the output of a shared cognitive algorithm, a set of evaluation criteria that had been installed not by choice or by conscious adoption, but by structural position, by decades of navigating the same institutional landscape, the same informal economy, the same carceral pipeline, the same relationship to formal institutions and their absence. Crip Mac was the dominant speaker. This is consistent with his public persona. He is a character in the most textured, most theatrical, most structurally honest sense of that word. He occupies space with volume, with gesture, with a performative intensity that fills any room he enters and that serves a specific function in the social environments he navigates. In the prison yard, volume is a survival tool. It establishes presence, it deters aggression, it declares that you are not to be trifled with. On the street, volume performs the same function. On a YouTube show, volume translates into entertainment value, which translates into screen time, which translates into relevance, which translates into the specific form of cultural capital that allows a man in Crip Mac's structural position to generate income from something other than the parallel economy. The first thing Crip Mac would do with nearly every woman who approached was announce himself, 55th Street General Baby. This phrase, repeated so frequently across the episode that it achieved an almost liturgical quality, was not bravado. It was not small talk. It was not an icebreaker. It was a structural declaration, an act of territorial and affiliational framing that established the terms of every subsequent interaction. 55th Street identifies his specific set within the neighborhood Crip hierarchy, not just Crip in general, but 55th Street specifically, which carries its own history, its own rivalries, its own territorial boundaries, its own internal politics. General Baby is a self-assigned rank, a claim to authority within that set's hierarchy. Together, the phrase announces, I am not merely a person. I am a jurisdictional entity. I'm embedded in a specific network of allegiances and enmities. Any relationship that develops from this point forward will exist within that network, subject to its rules, constrained by its boundaries, enriched by its protections, and endangered by its conflicts. Any woman who advanced past that declaration, who nodded or smiled or said okay, rather than turning and walking away, was implicitly accepting the terms. She was agreeing to enter a relationship that would be conducted within the framework of 55th Street's institutional ecosystem. She was agreeing that the man she was engaging with was, first and foremost, a member of that set, and that his membership would shape every aspect of their interaction, where they could go geographically, rival gang territories are off limits, who they could associate with socially, friends or family affiliated with rival gangs or liabilities, how they would navigate conflict through the set's internal mechanisms rather than through formal legal channels, and how they would manage the ever-present probability of incarceration, because the set's activities, and the mere fact of residing in the set's territory, generate continuous contact with law enforcement. Following the declaration, Crip Mac would deploy a series of questions that, on the surface, might appear to be standard speed dating fare. Where are you from? Do you have kids? Do you have a job? In any other context, on a mainstream dating show, in a speed dating event, at a bar, in a gentrified neighborhood, on a Bumble profile, these questions would be unremarkable. Where are you from? Is a conversation starter. Do you have kids? Is a compatibility check. Do you have a job? Is a baseline assessment of stability. But in this context, in this studio, asked by this man of these women, the questions were not what they appeared to be. They were reconnaissance. They were risk assessments. They were the cognitive output of a man whose structural position, whose entire lifetime of experience with institutions, with the criminal justice system, with the parallel economy, with the specific calculus of risk and reward that governs life in that position, had trained him to evaluate potential partners not on the basis of compatibility or attraction or shared interests, but on the basis of structural risk. Where are you from? Is not, tell me about your hometown so we can bond over shared geography. It is a territorial risk assessment. In Los Angeles, geography is identity in a way that middle-class Americans who experience geography as an expression of lifestyle preference cannot fully comprehend. Streets are not addresses, they are allegiances. Neighborhoods are not communities in the suburban sense, collections of houses organized around a school district and a property tax bracket. They are territories, bounded, defended, saturated with historical meaning, each one carrying associations with specific gangs, specific conflicts, specific histories of violence that can be triggered by the mere presence of a person from the wrong block. When Crip Mac asks a woman where she's from, he is mapping her onto this territorial grid. He is determining whether her geographic origin places her in alliance, in opposition, or in neutral territory relative to 55th Street. A woman from a neighborhood associated with a Hoover set, and Crip Mac has Hoover Killer tattooed on his forehead, is not merely geographically incompatible. She is a potential catalyst for violence. Do you have kids? Is not interest in family life. It is a probe of institutional entanglement, the degree to which a woman's life is enmeshed in the formal systems that the structural position positions as adversaries. A woman with children is involved with family court. She may have a custody arrangement that involves a co-parent, a man whose existence creates a competing allegiance, a potential source of conflict, a node in a network that the structural position cannot fully control. She is involved with the school system, which means she is periodically visible to state institutions in a way that a woman without children is not. She may be receiving public assistance, which means her financial life is partially transparent to government agencies. Every one of these institutional entanglements increases the surface area of contact between the woman's life and the formal systems that, for a man in Crip Mac's structural position, function not as supports, but as surveillance mechanisms. Children are not liabilities because they are expensive or demanding, though they are both. Children are liabilities because they tether a woman to the formal institutional grid in ways that create exposure for a man whose survival depends on minimizing his visibility to that grid. But there is another dimension to this question that is less about risk and more about practical assessment of carceral compatibility. If Crip Mac goes back to prison, and the structural probability of reincarceration for a man with his profile is not a speculation but a statistical near certainty, he needs a partner who can navigate the carceral support ecosystem. He needs someone who can receive collect calls from a federal facility at unpredictable hours. He needs someone who can send commissary funds through the correct channels. He needs someone who can manage the Byzantine visitation process. The approved visitor lists, the dress codes, the drive to whatever remote facility houses him, the metal detectors, the pat-downs, the time limits. He needs, in short, a woman whose own structural position has prepared her for the specific demands of being a partner to an incarcerated man. A woman with children may or may not be able to meet those demands, depending on her specific circumstances, but the question is designed to map her capacity. Do you have a job? Is perhaps the most structurally revealing question of all, because it is the question where the gap between the surface meaning and the structural meaning is widest. In mainstream culture, do you have a job is a screening question for economic self-sufficiency. A man who asks it is, in the conventional reading, looking for a partner who is financially stable, who won't be a drain on his resources, who has her life together. But Cripmack is not asking this question in that register. He knows, everyone in that room knows, that the women on this show are not accountants or engineers or registered nurses. The question is not, do you have a job, in the sense of, are you employed by a formal institution? The question is, what is your position in the parallel economy? The informal, largely unregulated constellation of income-generating activities that constitute the economic infrastructure of the structural position. The answers, OnlyFans, lashes, dancing, I'm an entrepreneur, content creation, are not failures to have a real job. They are the economic output of the structural position. They are what people do when the formal economy has excluded them through the compound effects of educational disinvestment, credentialism, felony, record discrimination, and geographic isolation from employment centers. And Cripmack is not judging these answers. He's mapping them. He's determining which sector of the parallel economy this woman occupies, what her income profile looks like, what her schedule flexibility is, how embedded she is in informal versus formal systems, and, again, how compatible her economic position is with the demands of being partnered with a man whose structural position includes periodic incarceration. Blueface's signature question operated in a different register, but carried the same structural weight. He would ask, "What's your sign?" This question, in mainstream dating culture, has been trivialized to the point of being a punchline. The lazy icebreaker, the astrologically obsessed millennials' substitute for genuine conversation. But in this context, the question is performing serious cultural work. Astrology, in the communities and structural positions occupied by the people in this room, functions as an alternative epistemological framework, a system for understanding the world that has grown in the vacuum left by the retreat or expulsion of formal knowledge systems. Christianity, the dominant religious framework in Black American life for generations, has declined in influence among younger generations, particularly among those whose structural position has been shaped by the specific failures of institutions that Christianity was supposed to redeem. The formal educational system, the apparatus of credentialed knowledge, of scientific literacy, of critical thinking, was never fully accessible to people in this structural position, and its partial accessibility was often experienced as alienating rather than empowering, being the only black kid in AP chemistry, being corrected for speaking in vernacular, being told your cultural knowledge doesn't count as knowledge. In the gap between a retreating Christianity and a never-arriving formal education, astrology has flourished, not as superstition, not as ignorance, but as a genuinely functional system for processing the unpredictability of life in a structural position where institutional support is absent and outcomes often feel arbitrary. When Blueface asks a woman her sign, he is signaling membership in this epistemological community. He is testing whether she shares his framework for making sense of the world. He is establishing a common language of meaning-making that does not rely on the vocabularies of religion or formal education, because those institutions are not the ones that shaped either of them. It is, in its way, as precise a structural probe as Cripmack's territorial questions. It maps the woman's relationship to knowledge systems, to institutional authority, to the specific cultural frameworks that develop in the absence of formal institutional embedding. Both men, throughout the episode, would make the women perform a 360-degree rotation, a full turn. This practice strips away the last veneer of romantic pretense. The 360 is the moment where everyone in the room, the men, the women, the host, the camera operators, the audience, acknowledges, silently and collectively, what is actually happening. This is not a dating show, this is a selection process. The criteria are physical. The men are evaluating bodies, not personalities. The 360 converts the social encounter into a visual inspection, and it is conducted with a matter-of-factness that suggests deep familiarity with the transactional framework, both on the part of the men requesting it and the women performing it. The 360 carries a structural genealogy that extends far beyond the conventions of YouTube dating content. The rotation of a human body for the visual evaluation of its physical attributes by people in a position of selection power echoes across historical contexts, livestock auctions, military fitness assessments, beauty pageants, and, in the specific historical memory of Black American life, the slave auction block. The comparison is not invoked casually or for shock value. It is invoked because the structural mechanics, the rotation, the inspection, the assessment of the body as an asset, resonate with a history that is not merely remembered but structurally inherited. The men are not slaveholders. The women are not enslaved. The context is radically different. But the structural position's genealogy includes that history, and the echoes are audible to anyone listening with structural ears. What was remarkable was that the women performed the 360 without protest, without visible discomfort, and in many cases with a practiced fluency that suggested deep familiarity with the dynamic. They understood the request. They understood what it meant. They understood that the encounter was transactional and that physical evaluation was the primary criterion. And they accepted the terms, not because they lacked dignity or self-awareness, but because the structural position they inhabited had taught them that this is how these encounters work. The parallel economy, in which the body is the primary asset, trains its participants to present the body for evaluation as naturally as the formal economy trains its participants to present a resume. The 360 is the resume review of the parallel economy, and the women who performed it were as professional in their execution as any candidate in a job interview. Cripmack's recurring interest in converting the women, in bringing them into his world, in assessing their willingness to be incorporated into his ecosystem, revealed yet another layer of the structural algorithm. He was not merely selecting women for physical attributes, he was evaluating convertibility, the degree to which a woman could be integrated into his structural ecosystem without introducing destabilizing institutional contact. A woman already embedded in a compatible structural position required less conversion than a woman embedded in a different one. The evaluation was not just, is she attractive, but how much structural friction would her integration produce? And what was most remarkable about the episode, from a structural perspective, was the degree to which both men's evaluative approaches were not merely similar, but synchronized. They did not plan their questions, they did not coordinate their criteria, they did not discuss in advance what they would prioritize or how they would evaluate, and yet their approaches converged with a precision that eliminated the possibility of coincidence. The same structural position had installed the same cognitive algorithm, and the algorithm ran the same way in both men, independently, simultaneously, producing identical outputs from identical inputs. Two processors running the same software on the same data set, generating the same results. Not because they agreed, because they were the same. The 20 women who appeared on the Blueface and Cripmack episode were not a random sample. They were cast, selected by the production team based on criteria that, while not publicly articulated, are consistent across the 20 versus 1 format and legible to anyone who has watched more than a few episodes. The criteria include physical attractiveness within a specific aesthetic register, willingness to appear on camera in a context that involves personal questioning and physical evaluation, availability during the production window, and proximity to the cultural ecosystem in which the show operates. The casting is intentional. It is designed to maximize entertainment value, which in this format means maximizing the contrast between the guests' evaluative criteria and the women's self-presentations, and maximizing the moments of humor, tension, and unexpected revelation that generate clips and comments. But to say that the women were cast is not to say that their presence on the show was artificial or unrepresentative. The casting did not create the structural homogeneity of the women. The casting revealed it. Or, more precisely, the casting drew from a population that was already structurally homogeneous, and the show's format made that homogeneity visible in a way that the women's everyday lives, dispersed across different neighborhoods, different platforms, different informal economic niches, normally obscures. Here is what was structurally diagnostic about the women who appeared on this episode, taken as a group rather than as individuals. Not one of them identified as occupying a role within the formal credentialed economy. This is not an exaggeration for rhetorical effect. It is a factual observation about the self-reported occupations of every woman who appeared on the episode. None said she was a registered nurse. None said she was an A registered nurse. None said she was an engineer. None said she was a teacher or a social worker or a paralegal or an accountant or a physical therapist or an IT specialist or a project manager or any other role that requires passage through the formal credentialing pipeline, the pipeline that runs from a high school diploma through a college degree or trade certification to a licensed or formally recognized professional position. Instead, the self-reported occupations clustered in a narrow band that constitutes what must be understood as a parallel economy. A constellation of income-generating activities that exists alongside and outside the formal labor market, that is not illegal in the way that the drug economy is illegal, that is not informal in the way that day labor is informal, but that exists in a specific structural register defined by the absence of formal credentials, formal institutional affiliation, and the specific forms of labor protection, health insurance, retirement benefits, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, that the formal economy provides. The occupations cited included OnlyFans creators, lash technicians, dancers, self-described entrepreneurs, content creators, social media personalities, hairstylists working independently rather than in licensed salons, makeup artists operating through Instagram bookings rather than through established studios, brand ambassadors whose brands are themselves products of the parallel economy, models whose modeling occurs on social media platforms rather than through agencies. The parallel economy is not a marginal or exotic sector of the American economic landscape. It is, in 2025, a massive and growing portion of how millions of people, particularly young people, particularly young women, particularly young people of color, generate income. But its growth is not a neutral development. It is a structural response to the systematic closure of formal economic pathways. The parallel economy grows when the formal economy contracts, when credential requirements escalate, when student debt makes education a risk rather than an investment, when felony records bar applicants from licensed professions, when the geographic distribution of formal employment concentrates jobs in areas that are inaccessible to people in certain structural positions, when the cost of childcare makes formal 9-to-5 employment economically irrational for single mothers. Each occupation in the parallel economy has its own structural logic. OnlyFans is not a lifestyle choice. It is the monetization of physical attractiveness and sexual appeal through a platform that requires no credential, no resume, no interview, no criminal background check, no commute, and no schedule that conflicts with childcare. It is, in economic terms, the most efficient labor market option available to a young woman whose structural position has closed the doors to credentialed professions. Lash technician work is not a rejection of traditional employment. It is an adaptation, a micro-credentialed skill, often learned through informal training rather than licensed cosmetology programs, that can be performed independently, on a flexible schedule, in the client's home or the technician's apartment without the overhead of a licensed salon or the institutional affiliation of a formal employer. Dancing, whether at clubs, at events, or in music videos, is the monetization of the body in a context where the body is the primary asset that the structural position has not devalued. Entrepreneur is the catch-all term for the full spectrum of informal income generation that does not fit neatly into any other category. Reselling goods, managing social media pages, promoting events, facilitating connections between people who have things and people who need things. None of these occupations is illegitimate. Many of them require genuine skill, hustle, creativity, and business acumen. A successful OnlyFans creator is a content producer, a marketer, a brand manager, and a customer service representative simultaneously, often generating income that exceeds what she would earn in an entry-level credentialed position. A skilled lash technician can build a client base that provides a comfortable living. But these occupations exist in a specific structural register. They are the careers available to women who, for reasons of educational access, criminal justice contact, economic background, geographic isolation, or systemic exclusion, did not enter the credentialed professional workforce. They are what grows in the soil that the formal system has abandoned. What this means, for the purposes of our analysis, is that the 20 women on this episode were not merely aesthetically similar, though they were, the casting ensured a degree of visual homogeneity. They were structurally identical. They occupied the same coordinates in the sorting machine's output space as the two men evaluating them. They had been processed by the same systems, excluded from the same institutions, channeled into the same alternative economies, and organized into the same relationship with the formal institutional grid, a relationship defined by distance, suspicion, and mutual incomprehension. There is a deeper dimension to the parallel economy that the episode revealed, and that warrants careful analysis, the degree to which the parallel economy is not merely an economic adaptation, but a complete civilizational alternative, a parallel society with its own institutions, its own credentialing systems, its own hierarchies of prestige, its own career pathways, and its own relationship to the formal world. The formal economy has universities. The parallel economy has Instagram follower counts. The formal economy has professional certifications. The parallel economy has brand partnerships and verification badges. The formal economy has performance reviews. The parallel economy has engagement metrics. The formal economy has retirement benefits. The parallel economy has the constant hustle of content creation, where the retirement plan is virality and the pension is relevance. The women on this show were not failed participants in the formal economy. They were successful participants in the parallel economy, an economy that, for people in their structural position, is not the backup plan but the primary plan, the only plan that the sorting machine's output space permits. To moralize about their occupations, to cluck about OnlyFans or shake one's head about lash technician work, is to miss the structural point so completely that the missing becomes itself a form of structural violence. It is the comfortable person looking at the adaptive behavior of the uncomfortable person and declaring the adaptation to be the problem rather than examining the conditions that made the adaptation necessary. Consider what would have to be true for these women to be registered nurses. They would have had to attend and complete high school in a school system that was funded well enough to prepare them for college-level coursework. They would have had to attend and complete a nursing program, a multi-year, expensive, credential-intensive pipeline that requires standardized test scores, prerequisite courses, clinical rotations, and a licensing examination. They would have had to navigate this pipeline without the interruptions that the structural position reliably produces: housing instability, childcare demands, economic crises that force withdrawal from school, family emergencies amplified by the absence of the social safety net, encounters with the criminal justice system that create gaps in the educational record and barriers to licensure. Each step on the formal credentialing pathway is a filter, and the filters are calibrated, whether intentionally or not, to screen out the very people whose structural position most urgently requires the income and stability that credentialed employment provides. The parallel economy exists because the formal economy's filters have excluded the people who populate it. Every woman on that show who said, "I do lashes," instead of "I'm a nurse," was providing a data point about the structural position, a data point that reveals not her individual choices, but the cumulative effect of school funding formulas, housing instability, childcare inaccessibility, and the 1,000 other variables that the sorting machine uses to determine who is allowed to access the credentialed economy and who is diverted into the parallel one. The aesthetic homogeneity of the women deserves its own analysis, because it is not merely a product of casting, it is a product of structural position expressing itself through the body. The specific way these women presented themselves, the hair extensions, the lash extensions, the nail art, the body contouring clothing, the specific relationship between revealed and concealed skin, the specific geometry of physical presentation that this subcultural context produces, is a cultural technology. It is the visual language of the parallel economy. Just as the formal economy has its dress codes, the business suit, the scrubs, the hard hat, the parallel economy has its dress codes, and those codes are as precisely calibrated, as intentionally deployed, and as structurally meaningful as any corporate uniform. The investment these women make in their appearance, the money spent on hair, on nails, on clothing, on body modification, is not vanity. It is capital investment. In the parallel economy, the body is the primary asset. Its presentation is the storefront. The lashes and the hair and the nails are the equivalent of the MBA graduate's suit and the doctor's white coat. They are the credentialing artifacts of a different economy, and the women who deploy them are as strategic and as deliberate in their deployment as any professional in the formal world. This is what made the episode feel less like entertainment and more like an ethnographic capture. Everyone in the room, the 2 men in blue, the 20 women in their various presentations of parallel economy femininity, even the host from Monroe, North Carolina, whose own position in the YouTube content economy is itself a form of parallel economy participation, occupied adjacent coordinates in the same structural space. The show was not a meeting of strangers. It was a gathering of people who had already been sorted into the same category by the same machine, who already spoke the same structural language, who already understood the same unspoken rules, who already inhabited the same relationship to the formal world and its institutions. Cripmac's recurring question, "Do you have a job?" takes on its full resonance in this context. He was not screening for employment status. He was navigating the internal geography of the parallel economy. He was determining which sector each woman occupied, what her income profile looked like, what her schedule was, how flexible her economic life was, and how compatible it was with the specific demands of being partnered with a man in his structural position. "I do lashes" positions a woman differently than "I'm a dancer" or "I do OnlyFans," not in moral terms. Cripmac is not making moral judgments about these occupations, and the absence of moral judgment is itself a structural artifact. Moralistic evaluation of labor is a luxury of people whose structural position provides them with respectable options, but in practical terms, income level, income stability, schedule flexibility, institutional visibility, and carceral compatibility. The women, for their part, demonstrated a fluency with the evaluative framework that would be inexplicable if they were newcomers to this dynamic, and that makes perfect sense if they, like the men, have been educated by the same structural position. They understood the 360, they performed it without protest or confusion, which means they understood that the encounter was transactional and that physical evaluation was the primary criterion. They understood the territorial questions. They answered, "Where are you from?" with the specific street-level geographic precision that signals familiarity with a world where geography is identity. They understood the sign question. They answered with their zodiac sign without any of the ironic distance that a woman from a different structural position might bring to the question. Because for them, astrology is not a guilty pleasure or a millennial trend. It is a functional knowledge system that they use daily to make sense of a world that the formal knowledge systems have not equipped them to navigate. What emerges from this analysis is not a portrait of 20 individual women, but a portrait of a social world, a complete, self-contained, internally coherent ecosystem with its own economy, the parallel economy, its own aesthetic codes, the specific presentation of attractiveness that the casting reflects, its own epistemological frameworks, astrology, street knowledge, social media fluency, its own relationship to formal institutions, distance, exclusion, suspicion, and its own internal stratification, OnlyFans. Creator ranks differently than Lashtech, which ranks differently than Dancer within the parallel economy's own hierarchy of prestige and income. The show captured this world in a single frame: 2 men in blue, 20 women in the parallel economy, one host with a camera, and a white-walled studio that functioned as a controlled environment in which the normally invisible architecture of a structural position became, for 65 minutes, perfectly visible. We have now arrived at the point where the threads must be drawn together, where the framework, the parent trap, the case studies, Blueface and Crip Mac, the ethnographic evidence, the episode itself, the questions, the women, and the structural analysis must converge into a single, coherent argument. The argument is this: there exists in American society a mechanism, a sorting machine, of such power, such complexity, such deeply embedded and self-reinforcing design that it can take 2 human beings, subject them to radically different configurations of experience, and deliver them, years or decades later, to the same structural coordinates. Not similar coordinates, the same coordinates, same show, same day, same blue, same tattoos, same build, same questions, same women, same structural position. The sorting machine is not a conspiracy. It is not a cabal of powerful people meeting in a room and deciding to constrain the outcomes of specific populations. Conspiracy theories are comforting because they imply that the system could be fixed by identifying and removing the conspirators. The sorting machine offers no such comfort. It is an emergent system, a phenomenon that arises from the interaction of an inconceivably large number of individual components, none of which, taken in isolation, appears to be deterministic, but which in aggregate produce outcomes with the regularity of natural law. The components are familiar. They have been cataloged by sociologists, economists, public health researchers, education scholars, and criminal justice reformers for decades. But the cataloging has typically been disciplinary, each field examining its own set of variables in isolation, each producing its own set of findings, each publishing in its own journals for its own audience. What has been missing is the integration, the recognition that these individual variables are not parallel causes operating independently, but interlocking gears in a single machine, each one turning the others, each one dependent on the others, the total system producing an output that no individual gear could produce on its own. Consider the variables as they apply to the structural position occupied by Blueface and Crip Mac, the position that the sorting machine assigned them at birth, place of origin. Not merely the city, Los Angeles, Ontario, but the specific microenvironment within the city, the block, the school district boundary, the census tract. The microenvironment determines nearly everything that follows because the microenvironment is the physical manifestation of the structural position. It determines the school determines the quality of education determines the credential, or the absence of a credential. The credential determines the employment options determine the income determines the next generation's microenvironment. The loop is closed. Familial profile. Not merely the presence or absence of parents, but the structural position of the parents themselves, their own education, their own employment, their own relationship to the criminal justice system, their own health, their own exposure to the stress, deprivation, and institutional violence that the structural position produces. A mother whose cortisol levels during pregnancy were elevated by the chronic stress of poverty and racial discrimination is producing, at the biological level, a child whose stress response system is calibrated for threat rather than for learning. The structural position is inscribed in the body before the body is born. School funding, the American system of funding public schools through local property taxes, is, in structural terms, the single most elegant mechanism ever devised for reproducing inequality across generations. A neighborhood with low property values produces low tax revenue, which produces low school funding, which produces low quality education, which produces low credential attainment, which produces low income, which produces low property values. The cycle is self-sustaining. It requires no malice to operate. It requires no racist intent. It requires only the continuation of a funding formula that was adopted in the 19th century and that has been maintained through a century of legal challenges and reform efforts because it serves the interests of the structural positions that benefit from it. Policing. The density of law enforcement activity in a given microenvironment is not a response to the actual crime rate in that microenvironment. It is a cause of the documented crime rate because crime rates measure police activity, arrests, reports, charges, rather than criminal behavior. A neighborhood that is heavily policed produces more documented crime, not because its residents commit more crimes, but because more of the crimes that are committed are detected, documented, and prosecuted. This produces criminal records. Criminal records produce employment barriers. Employment barriers produce dependence on the parallel economy. The parallel economy produces behavior that, when policed, generates additional criminal records. The cycle is, again, self-sustaining. Incarceration. The American prison system is not a response to crime. It is a structural feature of specific communities, a permanent, ongoing industrial-scale extraction of human capital from neighborhoods that are already resource depleted. When a man is incarcerated, his labor is removed from his community, his income is removed, his parenting is removed, his presence as a partner, as a friend, as a neighbor, as a voter, as a participant in civic life is removed, and the community, already weakened by the removal of previous generations of incarcerated men, absorbs the additional loss, which manifests as additional single-parent households, additional economic instability, additional stress, additional exposure of children to the conditions that produce the behavioral patterns that generate the next round of incarceration. The prison system does not interrupt the sorting machine. It is the sorting machine's primary enforcement mechanism. Cultural frameworks, the aesthetic codes, the linguistic patterns, the systems of value and meaning that develop within a structural position are not pathological. They are adaptive. The blue bandana is not a fashion choice. It is an affiliational technology that provides protection, identity, and community in an environment where formal institutions provide none of these things. The face tattoos are not aesthetic decisions. They are commitment devices, irreversible physical modifications that declare allegiance and foreclose alternative paths, functioning as a kind of corporeal contract with the structural position. The offbeat rap flow is not incompetence. It is an aesthetic innovation produced by a specific cultural environment. The parallel economy is not a failure of entrepreneurship. It is entrepreneurship in the absence of the institutional supports that mainstream entrepreneurship depends on. Now, when all of these variables, place of origin, familial profile, school funding, policing density, incarceration rates, cultural frameworks, and dozens more that space does not permit cataloging, are understood not as parallel causes but as interlocking gears in a single machine, the blueface-Crip-Mac convergence becomes not merely explicable but inevitable. The machine processed two inputs. The inputs differed in specific ways. One received a football scholarship, one did not. One charted on Billboard, one did not. One was a sex symbol, one was not. But the machine's algorithm does not weight these variables heavily enough to alter the output. The scholarship is a temporary diversion. The Billboard chart is a temporary elevation. The sex symbol status is a temporary aesthetic deviation. None of these variables changes the fundamental coordinates that the machine assigned at birth: the zip code, the school funding, the policing density, the incarceration probability, the relationship to formal institutions, the embedding in the parallel economy. The machine allows the diversion, the elevation, the deviation, because these temporary states generate content, generate revenue, generate narrative, the bootstrap story, the making it out story, the American dream story, that the larger system needs to sustain its legitimacy. But the machine does not release its grip. And when the temporary states expire, when the scholarship is dropped, when the music career stalls, when the prison sentence is served, the machine resumes its default processing, and the output converges with the output that was always predicted. Blueface did everything that the American narrative says you should do to escape the structural position. He excelled at athletics, he earned a scholarship, he left the state. When that path closed, he found another. He created a viral sensation. He charted on Billboard. He signed to a major label. He collaborated with the biggest names in the industry. He accumulated millions of views, hundreds of thousands of followers, enough money to live a lifestyle that appeared, from every conceivable angle, to constitute escape from the structural position of his birth. And the structural position won, not in a dramatic confrontation, not in a single catastrophic event, in the slow, grinding, almost geological reassertion of structural gravity. The legal troubles accumulated like sediment, each incident individually explicable, individually attributable to a bad decision, but collectively forming a pattern as regular and as predictable as erosion. The assault at the North Hollywood Lounge, the probation violation, the drug paraphernalia, each event a data point in a distribution that the structural position had defined before the events occurred. The probability of a man in Blueface's structural position, a black man from mid-city Los Angeles with gang affiliation, a felony-adjacent history, and embedding in the nightlife economy, encountering the criminal justice system, is not a function of his individual moral character. It is a function of the policing patterns, the prosecutorial discretion, the probation conditions, and the surveillance density that the structural position produces. Blueface did not fail to escape. Escape was never structurally available. Crip-Mac, by contrast, was never in the experimental group. He was the control. He never received the scholarship, never charted, never signed. He occupied his structural position without diversion, without elevation, without the temporary aesthetic deviations that fame provides. His path through the machine was the default path, the path that runs, uninterrupted, from the Inland Empire through the parallel economy, through the carceral pipeline, through the post-prison cultural economy of YouTube appearances and social media. And his output, the man who stood in that studio in blue, covered in tattoos, asking women if they have a job, is the machine's default output. It is the baseline. It is the control condition against which any claim of transcendence must be measured. The convergence of the experimental group, blueface, with the control group, cripmac, is, in the language of experimental design, the null result. It is the finding that the independent variable, in this case, fame, money, billboard charts, cash money records, football scholarships, everything that was supposed to make a difference, did not produce a statistically significant effect on the dependent variable, which is structural position. The treatment did not work, the intervention failed, the machine's output is robust to input variation, and what makes this null result so devastating is that it was not produced by a marginal intervention. Blueface did not receive a modest advantage and fail to capitalize on it. He received every advantage that the American system recognizes as transformative. He received athletic talent, the specific, measurable, recruiters come to your games kind of talent that is supposed to be the great equalizer. He received a college scholarship, the institutional pathway that the entire American educational ideology is built around. He received viral fame, the 21st century lottery win that is supposed to transcend all structural constraints because the internet, we are told, is the great democratizer. He received a major label record deal, the music industry's highest institutional validation. He received millions of dollars in income. He received cultural visibility on a scale that most people in any structural position never achieve, and none of it mattered. Not one of those advantages produced a permanent alteration in his structural coordinates. The scholarship did not prevent him from dropping out. The fame did not prevent him from accumulating legal troubles. The money did not prevent him from violating probation. The record deal did not prevent him from going to prison. The cultural visibility did not prevent him from emerging from prison looking, sounding, and behaving like a man who had never received any of those advantages. The null result was produced not by the absence of intervention, but by the overwhelming power of the structural position relative to any intervention the system is willing to provide. This has implications that extend far beyond the specific case of Blueface and cripmac. If the most dramatic intervention available, athletic talent plus scholarship plus viral fame plus major label deal plus millions of dollars plus cultural visibility, cannot produce a permanent alteration in structural position, then what can? If the treatment fails at maximum dosage, what does that tell us about the disease? If the input variation is this extreme and the output variation is this minimal, what does that tell us about the machine? It tells us that the machine is operating correctly. It tells us that the output is not a bug, but a feature. It tells us that the sorting machine was designed, not by a conspiracy, not by a committee, not by any single decision maker, but by the emergent interaction of 1,000 interlocking variables to produce exactly this result: the convergence of divergent paths, the neutralization of individual deviation, the reassertion of structural position over any configuration of talent, effort, and luck that the individual might accumulate. The machine was designed to produce the appearance of mobility, the scholarships, the fame, the money, the narratives of transcendence that the system needs to maintain its legitimacy, while preserving the reality of stasis, and it is functioning perfectly. This is, stated plainly, the destruction of the transcendence narrative, not a critique of it, not a complication of it, not a nuancing of it, its destruction. The narrative that individual talent and effort can overcome structural constraint is falsified, not in the abstract, not in the statistical aggregate, not in the footnotes of an academic paper, but in the specific, vivid, visually undeniable case of two men who took the most divergent paths imaginable within a shared structural position and arrived at the same coordinates. The narrative of making it out is revealed to be, in this case, and in the structural logic that this case exemplifies, a category error. It confuses movement within the structural position for movement out of it. It confuses climbing the treadmill-mounted ladder for ascending to a higher floor. It confuses the scenic route for an exit ramp. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, born in 1844 in Rücken, Saxony, the son of a Lutheran pastor who died when Nietzsche was 4, educated at the prestigious Schulpforta boarding school and the universities of Bonn and Leipzig. Appointed to a professorship at the University of Basel at the age of 24, one of the youngest people ever to hold such a position, is remembered primarily for 3 interlocking ideas that, taken together, constitute one of the most ambitious philosophical projects in Western history: the death of God, the Übermensch, and the will to power. The death of God is not, as popular culture often misconstrues it, a celebration or an advocacy. It is a diagnosis. Nietzsche, writing in the latter half of the 19th century, observed that the intellectual and cultural developments of modernity, the Enlightenment, the rise of science, the critique of religious authority, the secularization of European society, had rendered the Judeo-Christian God functionally obsolete as a source of cosmic meaning. God had not been argued out of existence. God had become irrelevant. And the consequence of this irrelevance was not liberation but crisis, the collapse of the entire moral and metaphysical framework that had organized Western life for 2 millennia. Without God, there was no transcendent source of value. Without transcendent value, there was no objective basis for morality. Without objective morality, there was, or so it seemed, nothing to prevent the descent into nihilism, the abyss of meaninglessness. the condition in which nothing matters because nothing means anything. The Übermensch, translated as overman, superman, or beyond man, is Nietzsche's answer to this crisis. The Übermensch is the human being who, confronting the death of God and the collapse of transcendent meaning, does not despair. Instead, the Übermensch creates meaning. The Übermensch generates values not by discovering them in nature or receiving them from heaven, but by willing them into existence through the force of creative self-assertion. The Übermensch, as articulated in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is the meaning of the earth, the being who justifies human existence not through obedience to God or nature or society, but through the sheer creative act of becoming more than what the world has determined you to be. The Übermensch self-overcomes. The Übermensch refuses to accept the values and limitations inherited from the past. The Übermensch creates new tables of value and lives according to them, regardless of what the herd, the mass of conformist humanity, demands. The will to power is the engine that drives the Übermensch's self-creation. And the will to power, as Nietzsche understood it, is not merely the desire for dominance or control, though it can manifest as those things. It is the fundamental drive of all living things to grow, to expand, to become more. It is the athlete who pushes past the limit. It is the artist who refuses to accept convention. It is the philosopher who demolishes inherited certainties and builds new ones. It is the force that, in Nietzsche's vision, separates the truly alive from the merely existing, the creators from the consumers, the ascending from the declining, the strong from the weak. Now, imagine standing Friedrich Nietzsche, this brilliant, tortured, syphilitic German professor who never married, who went insane at 44, who spent the last 11 years of his life in a vegetative state, cared for by his mother and then his anti-Semitic sister, in the white-walled studio of ryanwitdasauce. Imagine positioning him next to Blueface and Crip Mac as the cameras roll and the women approach. Imagine asking him, Professor Nietzsche, these two men, are they the Übermensch? Have they exercised the will to power? Have they self-overcome? Or have they been overcome? The question is not rhetorical, and the answer is not obvious. Because on one reading, a reading that takes Nietzsche at his most expansive and most generous, both men have exercised will to power in ways that satisfy at least the formal definition of the concept. Blueface took the raw material of his structural position, the gang affiliation, the street charisma, the offbeat flow, the face tattoo, the specific form of masculine beauty that his phenotype and his body provided, and transmuted it into something that did not exist before he created it. A sound, a persona, a career, a moment in popular culture. Thotiana did not exist in the world before Blueface willed it into existence. The viral meme of the offbeat rapper did not exist before he created the conditions for it. He took the constraints of his structural position and, through an act of creative will, converted them into cultural capital, financial capital, and a specific form of meaning. Is that not, in some legitimate Nietzschean sense, the will to power at work? Crip Mac, too, has created something. His public persona, 55th Street General Baby, the cusiness, the Hoover Killer tattoo, the blue everything, the unflinching documentation of a life lived at the rawest edge of structural precarity, is a creative achievement. It is, in its own register, a work of art. He took the materials that his structural position provided, the gang culture, the prison experience, the linguistic innovations, the physical presence, the humor that flourishes in environments of deprivation, and constructed from them a public identity so complete, so consistent, so theatrically compelling, that it functions as a kind of self-created mythology. He is the author of himself in a way that most people, comfortable, credentialed, institutionally embedded people, never achieve. He has willed his identity into existence. Is that not the will to power? And yet, the convergence that undermines every claim of transcendence, every assertion of will, every narrative of self-overcoming, because the will to power was exercised by both men, genuinely, with talent and effort and courage, and the structural position won anyway. The quarterback became the prisoner. The billboard artist became the man with the full face tattoos. The pretty boy became the big man in blue. The will to power was real. It was exercised. It produced real effects in the real world. And it was not enough. The orbit was not broken. The gravitational center held. The sorting machine, indifferent to the will that was being exercised within it, produced its default output. This presents a philosophical problem that Nietzsche, writing from the insulated environment of 19th century European academic life, may not have fully confronted. Nietzsche's entire philosophical project is predicated on a specific assumption, that there exists, for the individual, sufficient degrees of freedom to exercise will in a way that meaningfully alters the trajectory of a life. The Übermensch can emerge because the system, whatever its constraints, has enough slack, enough play in the gears, enough room for maneuvering, that individual will can find purchase and create change. The system does not have to be perfectly free, it just has to be free enough. But what if it isn't? What if, for certain structural positions, the system is so tightly calibrated, not by conspiracy, but by the emergent interaction of 1,000 interlocking variables, that individual will become merely a variation within a predetermined range? What if the will to power succeeds in the proximate sense? The scholarship is earned, the record deal is signed, the hit is charted, the millions of views are accumulated, but fails in the structural sense. The coordinates do not change, the incarceration probability does not decrease, the relationship to formal institutions does not transform, the output of the sorting machine remains robust to the input variation? In physics, there is a concept of a closed system, a system in which no energy or matter enters or leaves from the outside. Within a closed system, energy can change form, kinetic energy can become potential energy, heat can become work, chemical energy can become electrical energy, but the total energy of the system is conserved. You cannot create energy within a closed system. You can only convert it. The blueface-Crip-Mac convergence suggests that for certain structural positions in American society, the social system operates as a closed system. Energy, talent, effort, will, creativity can be converted from one form to another. Athletic talent converts into a scholarship. Musical talent converts into a record deal. Street reputation converts into a YouTube following. But the total structural position is conserved. The conversions are real. The new forms are genuinely different from the old forms. But the sum does not change. The coordinates remain the same. The will to power in a closed structural system becomes something Nietzsche never described and perhaps never imagined. The will to power is conversion without transcendence. The appearance of self-overcoming without the substance of it. The performance of escape within a system that does not allow actual exit. Blueface performed transcendence, and the performance was real, and the audience was real, and the billboard chart was real, and the money was real. But the transcendence was not real. The transcendence was a conversion of structural position from one form, precarity as anonymity, to another form, precarity as celebrity. The position itself, the coordinates, the probabilities, the relationship to institutions, the embedding in the sorting machine, did not change. And when the conversion expired, when the music career stalled, when the legal troubles accumulated, when the prison sentence was served, the structural position reasserted itself, and the man who had appeared to transcend reconverged with the man who had never tried. This is a devastating critique of Nietzsche, or more precisely, a devastating application of Nietzsche to a context he never imagined and could not have addressed. Nietzsche wrote about the European individual struggling against the conformist morality of Christianity and bourgeois society. His Übermensch was a creature of ideas, a being who would overcome inherited values by creating new ones, who would overcome herd morality by asserting individual will, who would overcome the death of God by becoming, in a sense, God's replacement. The struggle was intellectual, spiritual, aesthetic. The constraints were cultural and moral, soft constraints that could, in principle, be overcome by a sufficiently powerful mind and a sufficiently courageous spirit. But Blueface and Crip-Mac are not struggling against ideas. They are struggling against structures, against zip codes and school funding formulas and policing patterns and felony records and the physical infrastructure of neighborhoods that were designed, or more precisely, that emerged through the compound effect of decisions made by people who are now dead to sort specific populations into specific outcomes. You cannot will yourself out of a zip code. You cannot self-overcome your way past a school funding formula. You cannot creatively revalue the property tax base that determines the funding of the school, that determines the credential, that determines the job, that determines the income, that determines the neighborhood, that determines the structural position. The will to power applied to these structures is like pressing the gas pedal in a car that is on a treadmill. The engine revs, the wheels spin, the speedometer reads impressive numbers, and the car does not move. And so we arrive at the question that this entire essay has been building toward, the question that Nietzsche asked in a different context, but that resonates in the context of the Blueface-Crip-Mac convergence with a force that shakes the foundations of American self-understanding. How much truth can a spirit bear? How much truth can it dare? The truth that the convergence dares us to confront is this, that the will to power may be real, that individual agency may be genuine, that talent and effort and creativity and courage may all exist exactly as we perceive them. They are not illusions, they are not rationalizations, they are real capacities that produce real effects in the real world, and that none of it may be enough, that the sorting machine may be more powerful than the individuals it sorts, that the structural position may be more fundamental than the life that unfolds within it, that the orbit may be closed, that escape velocity for certain structural positions may be a mathematical impossibility, that what we call transcendence, what America calls making it out, may be nothing more than the scenic route to the same destination. The Parent Trap was a comedy about reunion, two identical twins separated at birth, discovering each other at summer camp and scheming to reunite their parents and restore the family to wholeness. It was warm, it was hopeful. It ended with the structural position affirmed as a source of belonging. The twins belonged together, and the structural forces that had produced them ensured that they would find each other regardless of the distances that separated them. This is not that. This is the structural position affirmed as a source of convergence so total, so comprehensive, so impervious to the most dramatic variations in individual experience that it makes the most divergent paths in the world, a football scholarship and a criminal record, a billboard chart and a YouTube arrest video, a cash money contract and a ghost gun charge, lead to the same white-walled studio, the same blue clothing, the same face tattoos, the same body mass, the same questions, the same women, the same show. This is not a comedy. This is not a tragedy. This is an empirical demonstration, captured on camera, visible to anyone with eyes, filed on YouTube for the world to see. That for some people, in some systems, at some structural coordinates, divergence is temporary and convergence is the only law that holds. The only law. The law that Blueface's scholarship could not repeal. The law that his billboard chart could not amend. The law that his fame, his money, his beauty, his talent, and his will to power could not overturn. Two men, two paths, one structural position, one destination. Same blue, same tattoos, same show. The phenomenon still has no name, and maybe that is the most honest ending. To acknowledge that we have spent tens of thousands of words circling a thing we cannot name, a thing that is larger than our vocabulary, a thing that the entire American ideological apparatus has been designed to keep unnamed, because naming it would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would mean confronting it, and confronting it would mean changing the machine, and the machine does not want to be changed. So we leave it unnamed. But we have seen it. We have seen it in a white-walled studio on a YouTube show, in the space between two men in blue who should have been nothing alike and who turned out to be the same person. That is enough. For now, that is enough.